When a feared mafia boss rescues a homeless woman from human traffickers, he believes he's saving a stranger. Days later, one shocking discovery changes everything. She is the long-lost daughter of a billionaire, and the people who stole her life are willing to kill again to keep the truth buried. You are listening to a story exclusively narrated on the Mafia Romance channel. Relax and step into the world of love stories filled with mystery, emotions, and passion. Don't forget to like, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment to support us. Rain fell over the docks like it was trying to wash away sins the city had stopped counting. Damien Romano stood in the shadows of a condemned warehouse on the edge of the Hudson, his black wool coat dark with water, his eyes darker still. Beside him, his second-in-command, Marco, shifted his weight, uneasy in a way that 10 years of blood and business had never made him before. "This isn't ours to touch," Marco said quietly. "The Bratva runs this operation. If we walk in there and start something, we start a war nobody asked for." "I didn't ask you to come," Damien said. He didn't raise his voice. He never had to. The men who worked for Damien Romano had learned a long time ago that his silences were more dangerous than another man's shouting. He was 34 years old and had inherited an empire built from concrete and corpses, and in the years since his father's death, he had made that empire colder, sharper, more efficient, and far more feared. But there was one rule Damien Romano had carried with him since he was a boy of 12, standing in a hallway, listening to his father laugh with men who bought and sold human beings like cattle. One rule that had nothing to do with territory or money. He did not deal in people. He never had, he never would. So when his men had intercepted a whisper of an underground auction happening tonight, buyers flying in from 3 continents, women being sold like furniture to the highest bidder, Damien had not needed to consult anyone. He had simply put on his coat. The warehouse smelled of mildew and cheap cologne and fear. Through a cracked door, Damien could see the floor below. A makeshift stage under work lights, folding chairs arranged in a crescent, men in expensive suits with drinks in their hands like they were at a charity gala. A voice boomed over a cheap microphone in Russian-accented English, calling out numbers, calling out flesh. And then she was pushed onto the stage. She was barefoot. Her wrists were bound in front of her with plastic ties that had cut angry red lines into her skin. Her hair, dark, matted, longer than it should have been for someone so thin, fell over a face that had been beautiful once and was now hollowed out by hunger and terror. She did not scream. She did not fight. She simply stood there with her eyes fixed on some point past the crowd, some point that didn't exist, as if she had learned that screaming only made things worse, and stillness was the only mercy left to her. Something happened in Damien's chest that he did not have a name for. He had seen suffering before, he had caused it, more times than he wanted to remember, but there was something about the emptiness in that woman's eyes, the complete and total absence of hope, that struck him like a fist to the sternum. "Lot 7, the auctioneer called. "A rare find, gentlemen. No family, no history, no one looking for her. Untraceable. We start the bidding at 200,000. A paddle went up, then another. Damien was already moving. "Boss!" Marco hissed, but Damien was through the door and down the metal stairs before Marco could stop him, his hand already inside his coat. He didn't draw the gun, not yet. He walked onto the floor of that warehouse like he owned it, because within the next 90 seconds he intended to. "Gentlemen," Damien said, his voice cutting through the auctioneer's stammering protest. "I'm afraid the lot's been withdrawn." A big man near the front, thick neck, brat for ink crawling up from his collar, stood. "You know whose operation this is?" "I know whose life ends tonight if anyone in this room touches that girl again," Damien said, and something in his voice made 3 armed men near the exits go very still. It wasn't a bluff. Everyone in that room who mattered, the men who moved product across borders, who paid off customs officials and judges, knew the name Romano, and knew that the men who carried that name did not make threats they didn't intend to keep. The Bratva lieutenant's jaw tightened, calculating the cost of pride against the cost of a war with the Romano family over one girl who, by his own auctioneer's words, was worth nothing to anyone. Money was rational, pride was not. "Take her," the man finally spat. "She's trouble anyway. Cried in her sleep the whole flight over. Kept saying a name nobody could understand." Damien didn't answer. He crossed the stage in 4 strides, shrugged off his coat and wrapped it around the girl's shoulders before he cut the ties at her wrists with a folding knife from his pocket. She flinched violently at his touch, flinched like she expected the knife to be for her, not for the plastic. And when their eyes met for the first time, Damien felt something inside him crack that he had thought was made of stone. "You're safe," he said, low, only for her. "No one is going to touch you again." She didn't believe him. He could see that instantly. The disbelief was etched into every line of her face, a disbelief so total it was almost peaceful, like a woman who had simply stopped expecting anything good from the world and had made her home in that expectation. "Can you walk?" he asked. She didn't answer. She simply looked at him, the way a wounded animal looks at a hand it doesn't trust, weighing whether to bolt or whether bolting would only make things worse. Damien lifted her instead. She weighed almost nothing, which made something in his chest twist violently, and carried her out of that warehouse, into the rain, past Marco's stunned face, past his own men, who had never once, in 10 years, seen Damien Romano touch another human being with anything resembling gentleness. "Boss, what the hell are we going to do with her?" Marco asked, as they reached the cars. Damien looked down at the woman in his arms. Up close, beneath the dirt and the hollow cheeks, there was a bone structure that spoke of some inheritance she couldn't have known about, a fineness to her features that didn't belong to the street. But that wasn't what stopped him. What stopped him was the sound she made against his chest, barely audible, half word and half breath. "Please," she whispered, "please don't sell me again." "No one is selling you," Damien said. "Not tonight. Not ever." He didn't know yet what those words would cost him. He didn't know that the woman in his arms was about to become the single most dangerous, most precious, most world-altering possession. No, not possession. He would learn to hate that word. The single most important person he would ever hold. He only knew as he laid her gently into the back seat of the armoured Mercedes and watched her curl instinctively into the corner, as far from him as the space allowed, that he was not going to let her go. He had broken his own rule tonight. He had let something into his life that had nothing to do with money or power. He had let in a ghost with no name, no past, and eyes that haunted him more than any man he'd ever killed. She would not eat. For 3 days, Sophia, the name Damien had given her, borrowed from his mother because the girl had no name of her own to offer, only a flinch when he asked, sat in the corner of the guest suite at the Romano estate, knees drawn to her chest, and refused every tray of food his housekeeper brought. "She thinks it's poisoned," Marco said on the second day, standing beside Damien in the hallway outside her door, watching through the crack as the girl stared at a bowl of soup like it might bite her. Or she thinks eating means she owes something. People who've been through what she's been through, they learn that nothing is free. Damien said nothing. He had learned in the 3 days since the warehouse that the girl called Sophia startled at footsteps, flinched from open hands, and screamed in her sleep with a violence that woke the entire east wing of the mansion. He had also learned, though he would never have admitted it to Marco, that he found himself standing outside her door at 2 in the morning, listening for the sound of her breathing, needing to know she was still there. He didn't understand it. Damien Romano did not stand outside women's doors. Damien Romano did not lie awake because a stranger's nightmares disturbed him. He had built his entire life on the principle of controlled distance. You did not get close to anything you couldn't afford to lose, and in his world, everything could be taken from you, eventually. His father had taught him that with a bullet through the chest on a Tuesday afternoon, betrayed by a man he'd called brother for 20 years. And yet here he was. On the 4th day, he brought the tray himself. Sophia recoiled when the door opened, pressing herself into the corner like she could disappear into the wallpaper. Damien moved slowly, slower than he moved for anything else in his life, and set the tray on the small table by the window, then took a step back, giving her room, the way you'd give room to something wild that might bolt. "You don't have to eat it," he said, "but I'd feel better if you did. I have very few things I actually care about, and apparently your survival has become one of them, which is inconvenient for both of us." It was the closest thing to a joke he'd made in years, and he wasn't entirely sure why he'd made it. Something about her stillness made him want to fill the silence, made him want to be less like the man everyone else in his life saw. Sophia's eyes flicked to him, quick, assessing, the eyes of someone who had learned to read danger in the smallest movements. "Why?" she said. Her voice was hoarse from disuse, cracked like old leather. It was the first full word she'd spoken to him. "Why what? Why do you care?" Damien considered lying. He was good at lying. It was, in some ways, the family business as much as the drugs and the guns and the shipping routes. But something about her directness, about the rawness of the question, made him want to answer honestly, which frightened him more than any enemy ever had. "I don't know," he admitted. "I've asked myself the same question for 4 days. I don't have an answer that makes sense." Something shifted in her face. Not trust, not yet, but a fractional loosening, like a held breath finally released halfway. She looked at the soup, then, achingly slowly, she reached for the spoon. Damien left the room before she could see what that small act did to him. Over the following weeks, the mansion on the hill became a strange, quiet theatre of small victories. Sophia learned the sound of Damien's footsteps and stopped flinching at them. She learned that the housekeeper, Elena, hummed old Italian songs while she cooked, and that the humming meant safety, not threat. She learned that the west wing of the house, with its floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the vineyard, was the only place in the mansion where the sunlight didn't feel like an interrogation lamp. She still would not sleep with the door closed. She still woke most nights, screaming a name that made no sense. "Mama, don't leave me here, don't leave me here." Words that clawed at something in Damien's chest he didn't have language for. She still flinched from every hand that reached toward her, except, gradually, his. He noticed the birthmark on her collarbone one evening in September, when she'd finally allowed Elena to cut her hair and had worn for the first time one of the simple blouses Damien had ordered for her, without ever having seen her in anything but oversized sweaters. A small mark, shaped almost like a crescent moon, just below her left collarbone. He didn't think anything of it then. It would take months before that small mark would detonate an entire conspiracy that had been buried for 23 years. "You don't have to keep me here," Sophia said one night, standing in the doorway of his study, wrapped in a blanket she carried with her like armour. It was nearly midnight. Damien was reviewing shipping manifests that were, in truth, ledgers of a criminal empire dressed up in corporate language, and he set the papers down the instant he heard her voice. "I'm not keeping you," he said. "You can leave whenever you want. There's a car, there's money, there's a driver who'll take you anywhere in the world you want to go." "Then why haven't I left?" Damien didn't answer immediately, because the true answer, because you don't want to, and because some part of you has decided that this house, this dangerous man, is the safest place you've ever known, was not his to give. It was hers to discover. "Maybe," he said finally, "because some part of you knows I mean it when I say no one will touch you here, not while I'm breathing." Sophia looked at him for a long moment, the same searching, cataloguing look she gave everything, as if the world were a series of traps she had to map before she could walk through it safely. Then, for the first time since the warehouse, she almost smiled. "You're a strange man, Damien Romano," she said. "You have no idea," he answered, and meant it more than she could possibly know. The men who worked for Damien Romano began to notice the change before Damien did. It started with small things. He stopped taking calls after 9 at night, something unheard of in a business that operated across time zones, where 9 p.m. in New York was 3 a.m. in Palermo, and business never truly slept. He cancelled a meeting with the Vantano family, men who controlled the ports on the Jersey side and whose cooperation Damien needed for a shipment worth $11 million, because, as he told Marco with a look that dared him to comment, something came up. The something was Sophia waking from a nightmare so violent that Elena had come running for Damien at 2 a.m, unable to calm her, and Damien had sat on the floor outside her door, not inside, because she still couldn't bear anyone in the room with her when the terror hadn't fully receded, talking to her through the wood in low, even tones until her breathing slowed and the sobbing stopped. "You're not what I expected," she'd said afterward, her voice thin through the door. "What did you expect?" "A monster. Everyone talks about you like you're a monster. Eleanor crosses herself when she says your name." Damien huffed something that wasn't quite a laugh. "I am a monster, Sophia. Eleanor isn't wrong to cross herself. I've done things that would make you run from this house screaming if you knew half of them." "Then why aren't you a monster to me?" He didn't have an answer for that either. It was becoming a pattern. This woman kept asking him questions that unearthed things in him he'd buried so deep he'd forgotten they existed. "Maybe," he said slowly, "because you're the first person in a very long time I've wanted to be something else for." Silence on the other side of the door. Then, "Don't change for me. Just be honest with me. That's all I've ever wanted from anyone. Honesty." It was a strange thing to want, from a woman who remembered almost nothing about her own life, who couldn't tell him her age with certainty, who didn't know if she had siblings, who woke up screaming names she couldn't place to faces she couldn't see. But Damien understood it instinctively, because honesty was the one thing his entire world was built on the absence of. Every man in his organization lied for a living. Every deal was built on the assumption that someone, somewhere, was getting cheated. Sophia's plea for honesty was, in its own way, the most radical thing anyone had ever asked of him. "I'll try," he said. "I've never been good at it, but I'll try. For you." Weeks folded into each other. Autumn stripped the vineyard bare and dressed the hills in gold and rust, and Sophia began, slowly, to bloom in ways that terrified Damien more than any rival family ever had, because he understood, with the clear, cold logic that had kept him alive in a business that killed most men before 40, that he was falling in love with a woman who had no past, no name of her own, and no idea what kind of man he truly was. He took her to the vineyard one afternoon, the first time she'd agreed to leave the house since the warehouse. She wore a cream sweater and jeans that Elena had picked out, and the wind moved through her now shoulder-length hair, and for a moment, just a moment, she looked like someone who had never known a single day of suffering. "Do you remember anything?" Damien asked, walking beside her between the rows of dormant vines. "Even fragments, a colour, a smell, anything." Sophia was quiet for a long moment, her hand trailing along the wooden trellis. "Sometimes I hear a song," she said finally, "a lullaby. I don't know the words, not really, but I know the tune. It comes to me sometimes, in my sleep, or when it's quiet like this. I don't know where it's from, I don't know who sang it to me, but it feels like the only thing that's really, truly mine." "Sing it," Damien said, "if you want to." She looked at him, surprised, as if she expected him to laugh, or worse, to be indifferent. When she saw that he meant it, that he was watching her with the same intensity he brought to a boardroom negotiation, except now it was aimed entirely at her, at the fragile thread of melody she was about to offer him, she began to hum, low and halting, a tune that rose and fell in a minor key, achingly tender, achingly sad. Damien felt something in his chest seize. He didn't know why. The melody meant nothing to him. He'd never heard it before, had no reason to recognize it, and yet something about the way she sang it, the unconscious grief in every note, made the hair on his arms rise. "That's beautiful," he said when she trailed off, embarrassed. "I don't even know what it means." "It doesn't have to mean anything right now," Damien said. "It's yours. That's enough." She looked up at him then, and for the first time since the warehouse, there was no fear in her eyes at all, only something warmer, something that made Damien's carefully constructed control crack right down the middle. "Thank you," she whispered, "for not asking me to be anyone but who I am right now. Even though I don't know who that is." "You're Sophia," Damien said, reaching out, slowly, giving her every chance to pull away, and brushing a strand of hair from her face when she didn't. "That's who you are, and it's enough for me." He didn't know, standing in that vineyard, with the last of the autumn light gold on her face, that the melody she'd just hummed for him was a lullaby, written by a mother who had been murdered 23 years earlier. a mother whose death his own father had ordered. He didn't know that the peace he felt in that moment was built on a lie so old it predated his own memory. He only knew that he was falling, and that for the first time in his life, he didn't want to stop. Vespa was the crown jewel of Damian Romano's legitimate holdings. A nightclub in the meatpacking district so exclusive that reservations were measured in months, so beautiful that magazines photographed its marble bar and gold-veined ceiling as if it were art, rather than a place men in Damian's world laundered money between bottle service and blackmail. He didn't bring Sophia there to show her off. He told himself that at least. He brought her because she'd asked. Quietly, one evening, staring out the window at the lights of the city she couldn't remember ever having lived in, whether there was more to the world than the mansion and the vineyard, whether she was allowed to want to see it. "You're allowed to want anything," Damian had told her. "The only question is whether you're ready." She wasn't, not entirely. He could see it the moment they stepped out of the car, the way her shoulders drew inward at the sight of the crowd outside the velvet rope, the way her hand found his sleeve and gripped it like an anchor. But she didn't ask to go back. She squared her shoulders instead, the way he'd watched her do 100 times in the months since the warehouse, forcing herself forward through fear, because retreating had never once, in her whole shattered memory, made anything better. Inside, the club was a symphony of low light and expensive perfume, a crowd of the beautiful and the dangerous mingling in a way that made the line between the two intentionally blurred. Damian led her to the private booth reserved permanently for the Romano family, and for an hour something like ordinary happiness settled over their table. Sophia laughing, actually laughing at something Marco said, her head tilted back, the sound so unfamiliar and so precious that Damian found himself unable to look away. Then Isabella Conti arrived. Isabella was the daughter of a rival capo, a woman Damian had once, years ago, considered marrying purely as a matter of alliance, a transaction of blood between two families, the way things were done in his world, before he decided he wanted no wife at all, political or otherwise. She was beautiful in the practiced, armoured way of women raised in his world, every smile a calculation, every touch a negotiation. "Damian," she said, sliding into the booth uninvited, her hand landing on his arm with familiar possession. "It's been too long. You never call anymore." "I've been busy," Damian said, and did not remove her hand immediately, because in his world subtlety mattered, and an abrupt rejection of Isabella Conti in a room full of watching eyes could ignite a diplomatic incident he didn't have the patience for tonight. But Sophia had gone very still beside him. Isabella's eyes slid to Sophia with the practiced disdain of a woman assessing a rival she didn't yet know was a rival. "And who's this? Your latest charity project? I heard you'd taken in some stray from the docks. How very noble of you, Damian. Very unlike you." The words landed like a slap. Damian felt Sophia flinch beside him. Not visibly, not in any way a stranger would notice, but he had spent months learning the precise language of her body, and he felt the retreat happening in real time, felt her folding inward the way she used to before she'd learned this house was safe. "Careful," Damian said, and his voice dropped into the register that made grown men in his organization go pale. "You're speaking about someone I care for very deeply, Isabella. I'd choose the next words out of your mouth with considerably more thought." Isabella blinked, recalibrating. She had known Damian Romano for 15 years and had never once heard him defend a woman with that particular tone. Not for her, not for anyone. My apologies, she said, though her eyes said otherwise.
I didn't realize it was serious.
It is, Damien said, and reached under the table to take Sophia's hand, lacing his fingers through hers in a gesture that was, for him, an act of enormous and unprecedented vulnerability. A public claim, in front of a woman whose family could use any information as leverage, that this fragile, nameless woman mattered more to him than 15 years of careful political neutrality. Isabella left the booth a few minutes later, her smile brittle, already composing in her head the story she'd tell her father about the woman who'd apparently ensnared Damien Romano's heart. "I'm sorry," Sophia whispered once they were alone again. "I made things difficult for you." "You didn't make anything difficult," Damien said, turning to face her fully, his thumb tracing slow circles over her knuckles. "She did. And I meant what I said. You matter to me more than any alliance, any deal, any piece of territory I've ever fought for. Do you understand that?" "I don't understand why," Sophia said, and there was real anguish in her voice now, an old wound reopening. "I don't have anything to offer you. I don't even have a name that's really mine. You're a king in this world, Damien, and I'm nobody. I'm less than nobody. I'm a woman who was being sold like cattle 4 months ago." "You're not nobody," Damien said, fierce now, gripping her hand tighter. "You're the only person in this entire city who's ever looked at me and seen something other than power or fear. Everyone else wants something from me. Territory, money, protection, an alliance. You've never once asked me for anything except honesty. Do you have any idea how rare that is? How much that's worth to a man like me?" Sophia searched his face for a long moment, and whatever she found there, whatever raw, unguarded truth was written across the features of a man who had spent his entire life being feared rather than known, seemed to settle something in her. "I don't remember who I was before the docks," she said quietly. "I don't remember my mother's face, or my own name, or a single birthday. But I remember every second since you carried me out of that warehouse. And if that's the only life I get to have, if that's the only story that's really mine, then I want it to be with you." Damien didn't kiss her that night. He wanted it with an intensity that frightened him, but he understood, with the same instinct that had kept him alive through a decade of war, that Sophia's trust was a thing built one careful stone at a time, and he would not be the man who rushed her past her own readiness. Instead, he simply held her hand across the table, in front of the entire glittering, dangerous world that knew his name, and let every person in that club understand, without a word spoken, exactly what she meant to him. He didn't know that Isabella Conti, humiliated and furious, would make a phone call before the night was over. A phone call to a man who had been quietly searching for a missing heiress for 23 years. A phone call that would begin the unravelling of everything Damien thought he understood about the woman he loved. Winter came early that year, dusting the vineyard in a fine white powder that turned the mansion's grounds into something out of a dream neither Damien nor Sophia quite believed they were allowed to have. Sophia had changed in ways that still stunned Elena, who had known Damien since he was a boy and had never seen him soften for anyone the way he softened, wordlessly, completely, around the woman he'd carried out of a trafficking warehouse. Sophia laughed now, really laughed, not the careful testing sound of someone unsure if joy was permitted. She'd taken to cooking with Elena in the mornings, her hands finally steady enough to hold a knife without her knuckles going white with old terror. She still woke sometimes, screaming a name she didn't understand, still flinched at sudden movements from anyone but Damien. But the nightmares had thinned, like fog burning off under a stronger sun. "You're different when you're with her," Marco said one evening, watching from the doorway as Damien helped Sophia untangle a string of lights for the mansion's first Christmas tree in a decade. "I've known you since we were kids, running errands for your father. I've never seen you like this." "I don't recognize myself either," Damien admitted, and there was no shame in the admission, only a kind of wonder. The wonder of a man who had assumed for 34 years that he was constitutionally incapable of the thing that was currently happening to him. That night, after Elena had gone home and the mansion had settled into its particular hush, Damien found Sophia standing at the window of the study, watching snow fall over the vineyard in the moonlight. "Can't sleep?" he asked. "I don't want to sleep," she said. "I don't want the nightmares to take tonight away from me. It's been such a good day." Damien crossed the room and stood beside her, close enough to feel the warmth radiating from her, close enough that 6 months ago she would have flinched away, and now she simply leaned, fractionally, into the space between them. "Tell me something," he said. "Anything. I want to know everything you're thinking, even the things that don't make sense." Sophia was quiet for a long moment, watching the snow. "I used to think I was cursed," she said finally. "That whatever happened to me before the docks, whatever I can't remember, it must have been because I did something to deserve it. That's what you tell yourself when you're on the street, when men look at you like you're an object instead of a person. You start to believe the way they see you is the truth of what you are." "That's not true," Damien said, low, fierce. "None of what happened to you was ever your fault. You didn't do anything to deserve any of it." "I know that now," Sophia said, turning to look at him, and there was something in her eyes, a clarity, a certainty that hadn't been there in months. "Because of you. Because you've spent every day since that warehouse proving to me that I'm worth something, that I'm not what they made me believe I was." "You were always worth something," Damien said. "You just needed someone to survive long enough to show you." "Damien." His name in her mouth was soft, deliberate, the way she said it when she wanted him to really listen. "I love you." The words detonated something in his chest that 10 years of running an empire built on fear had never once touched. Damien Romano had been told many things by many people: admiration, loyalty, obedience, even desire. But no one, not since his mother died when he was 19, had ever said those 3 words to him and meant them the way Sophia meant them now. Without agenda, without leverage, without a single transactional thought behind them. "I love you too," he said, and his voice cracked on the words in a way that surprised them both. "I think I've loved you since the moment I saw you on that stage, and understood, somehow, in some part of me that doesn't make logical sense, that I would burn my entire empire to the ground before I let anyone touch you again." He kissed her then, finally, after months of careful distance, of waiting for a readiness he could never rush, and it was nothing like the kisses he'd exchanged with a dozen other women over the years, transactional or careless or purely physical. It was slow, and it was reverent, and it asked permission with every fraction of a second, giving her every chance to pull away. And when she didn't pull away, when she rose onto her toes and kissed him back with a hunger that had been starved for far longer than 4 months. Something in Damien Romano's chest that had been frozen since his father's murder finally, completely thawed.
"I've never done this before,"
Sophia whispered against his mouth, breathless. "Not like this. Not because I wanted to." "We don't have to do anything you're not ready for," Damien said, pulling back just enough to look at her, his hands framing her face with a gentleness that felt like the opposite of everything he was known for in every other room of his life. "I have all the time in the world for you, Sophia. I'm not going anywhere." "I know," she said, and smiled, a real smile, unguarded, the smile of a woman who had finally, after a lifetime of unremembered horror, found a place in the world where she was safe enough to want things for herself. "That's why I'm not afraid tonight." They stood together at the window for a long time after that, watching the snow bury the vineyard in white. Sophia's back against his chest, his arms wrapped around her, like a vow neither of them had spoken aloud yet, but both of them understood. Neither of them knew that 300 miles away, in a penthouse office overlooking the Chicago skyline, a billionaire named Alexander Reyes was staring at a photograph of a phone call transcript from a woman named Isabella Conti. A transcript describing a nameless woman with a crescent-shaped birthmark below her collarbone, living under the protection of the Romano crime family. Neither of them knew that the peaceful winter they were building, stone by careful stone, was about to be shattered by a truth 23 years in the making. The announcement came on a Tuesday morning, splashed across every news network in the country, with the particular breathless urgency reserved for stories involving obscene amounts of money. Billionaire Alexander Reyes offers $500 million reward for return of daughter missing since infancy. Damien saw it first on the muted television in his study, the words scrolling beneath a photograph of a distinguished silver-haired man standing at a podium bristling with microphones, flanked by a younger man and woman who bore the same aristocratic bone structure, the same practiced composure of people born into wealth so vast it had its own gravitational pull. 23 years ago, the anchor's voice explained over file footage of a much younger Alexander Reyes, hollow-eyed and frantic, being led away from a nursery with police tape across the door. Infant Isabel Reyes was abducted from the family's Connecticut estate in what authorities called at the time one of the most sophisticated kidnappings in American history. Her mother, Catherine Reyes, died 6 months later of what was ruled a suicide, though conspiracy theories about her death have persisted for decades. Now, in an unprecedented move, Alexander Reyes has announced a reward of $500 million for verified information leading to his daughter's safe return, believed to be, if alive, 23 years old. Damien felt something cold settle in his stomach, a sensation he recognized from 20 years in a business built on instinct and danger. The specific, unmistakable feeling of a trap closing somewhere just out of sight. 23 years old. A birthmark, the reporter continued, quoting from the original police file. A crescent-shaped mark below the left collarbone, one of the few identifying features that could prove the child's identity beyond DNA. Damien's hand went cold around the remote. He found Sophia in the kitchen, humming that same half-remembered lullaby while she helped Elena knead dough for the evening's bread. Sunlight through the window turning her hair gold, looking more at peace than he had ever seen another human being look in his entire violent life. He stood in the doorway for a long moment, unable to make himself speak, because some part of him, the part that had spent a decade reading rooms and calculating threats before they materialized, already understood, with a certainty that made his chest ache, exactly what he was about to lose. "Damien?" Sophia looked up, flour dusting her hands, her smile fading as she read something in his face. "What's wrong?" "I need to show you something," he said. "Come with me." He led her to the study, sat her down, and played the news segment again, watching her face rather than the screen, watching the exact moment the anchor described the crescent-shaped birthmark, and Sophia's hand rose unconsciously to trace the mark below her own collarbone. "That's—" She stared at the frozen image of Catherine Reyes, a woman with dark hair and haunted eyes, holding an infant swaddled in white, and something in the shape of that woman's face, in the particular tilt of her head, made Sophia's breath catch in a way that had nothing to do with conscious memory and everything to do with something buried far deeper. "Damien, that lullaby, the one I hum. I need you to hear something." She hummed it again, the melody she'd offered him in the vineyard months ago, and Damien, with hands that were not entirely steady, pulled up the archived audio from the original 2003 investigation, a recording, preserved by the FBI, of Catherine Reyes singing to her infant daughter on a home video seized as evidence. It was the same song, note for note, word for word, in the fragments where words existed at all. Sophia's hand flew to her mouth. "That's not possible," she whispered. "That's not... I can't be..." "We don't know anything for certain," Damien said, though every instinct honed by years in an industry that dealt in secrets was screaming otherwise. It could be a coincidence. Lullabies get passed down, they get shared. "Don't," Sophia said, her voice suddenly sharp, cutting through his attempt at comfort. "Don't lie to me. You promised me honesty, Damien. Look at me and tell me you don't believe it." Damien looked at her, at the birthmark, at the bone structure that so closely mirrored the woman in the frozen video frame, at eyes the exact same shade of storm grey as the man standing at that podium. And he could not, in good conscience, lie to the only person who had ever asked that of him, and meant it. "I believe it," he said quietly. "I think you might be Isabel Reyes. I think you might be the missing heiress the entire country has been searching for since before either of us understood what loss even meant." Sophia was silent for a long time, staring at the frozen image on the screen. A mother she couldn't remember, a childhood stolen before she was old enough to grieve its absence, a fortune measured in the hundreds of millions attached to a name that wasn't the one Damien had given her. "If this is true," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper, "what happens to us?" It was the question Damien had been dreading since the moment he'd seen the anchor's face flash across the screen, because he did not have an answer that didn't terrify him. He was Damien Romano, a mafia boss, a man whose family had killed and stolen and built an empire on the suffering of people just like the woman sitting across from him now. If Sophia was truly Isabel Reyes, heiress to one of the largest fortunes in the country, then the gulf between them had just widened into something that felt, for the first time since the warehouse, genuinely insurmountable. "I don't know," Damien admitted, reaching for her hand, needing the physical contact like a drowning man needs air. "But whatever you decide, whatever this truth turns out to be, I need you to know that I'm not going anywhere. Reward or no reward, Fortune or no fortune, I fell in love with a woman named Sophia, who hummed a lullaby in a vineyard and made me believe for the first time in my life that I could be something other than the monster everyone else sees. That woman is still sitting in front of me right now, whatever name the world decides to give her. Sophia's eyes filled with tears, not the terrified tears of the woman he'd carried out of that warehouse, but something more complicated. Grief and hope and fear tangled together into an emotion that had no single name. "I'm scared," she admitted. "I'm scared of who I might have been. And I'm scared of what it might cost us if I find out." "Then we'll find out together," Damien said. "Whatever it costs." He didn't know, as he said those words, exactly how much it would cost. He didn't know that the family waiting to welcome Isabel Reyes home was not celebrating out of love, but out of terror. Terror that her return would unravel a conspiracy that had murdered her mother and buried a fortune in lies for over 2 decades. He didn't know that his own father's name was written in ink 23 years old into the very heart of that conspiracy. The lab results took 11 days, and Damien spent every one of them watching Sophia unravel and reassemble herself in ways that broke his heart and rebuilt his admiration for her in equal measure. He had insisted on discretion, a private lab, a doctor bound by an NDA so ironclad it would have made a Supreme Court justice blink, blood drawn in the mansion's own medical suite rather than any facility that could leak information to the press or, more dangerously, to whoever had orchestrated Sophia's original disappearance. Because Damien Romano had not survived a decade at the top of a criminal empire by trusting coincidence, and something about the timing of this revelation, a woman with no memory surfacing at a human trafficking auction just months before a $500 million reward was publicly announced, itched at him like a wound that wouldn't close. "You think someone did this on purpose?" Marco said on the 9th day, as they sat in Damien's study, reviewing the same shipping manifests neither of them had the concentration to actually read. "You think someone put her in that warehouse?" "I think," Damien said slowly, "that it's a very large coincidence that the woman I fell in love with happens to share a birthmark and a lullaby with a missing heiress worth $500 million. And I don't believe in coincidences that large." "What are you going to do if she is the heiress?" Damien didn't answer immediately. He was watching, through the study window, Sophia walking the frost-rimmed rows of the vineyard alone, her coat wrapped tight around her, her breath visible in the cold morning air. She looked, from this distance, like the loneliest person in the world. A woman standing at the edge of 2 entirely different lives, unable yet to know which one truly belonged to her. "I'm going to protect her," Damien said finally, "whatever that means, whatever it costs me." The results came back on a grey Thursday afternoon, delivered not by phone but in person by the doctor Damien trusted with his life, a man who had stitched Damien's own wounds more times than either of them cared to count. "It's a match," the doctor said without preamble, sliding the folder across the desk. 99.99% probability. She's your daughter. She's their daughter. Isabel Catherine Reyes, born March 14th, 23 years ago, at Yale New Haven Hospital. There's no ambiguity here, Damien. This is her." Damien sat with the folder unopened for nearly 10 minutes after the doctor left, staring at it like it contained a bomb rather than paper, because, in a very real sense, it did. He found Sophia in the library, curled into the window seat, with a book she wasn't really reading, and when she looked up and saw his face, she seemed to already know. "It's confirmed," she said, not a question. "Yes." Sophia closed the book slowly, her hands trembling in a way Damien recognized from the earliest days after the warehouse. The tremor of someone whose entire world had just shifted beneath her feet without warning. "I'm her," she said. "I'm Isabel Reyes." "You're still Sophia," Damien said quietly, crossing the room to kneel beside the window seat, taking her cold hands in his. "That's not a lie because of a piece of paper. You're still the woman who hummed me a lullaby in a vineyard. You're still the woman I love. This just means you have a family out there who's been looking for you." "A family who abandoned me," Sophia said, and there was an edge in her voice he hadn't heard before, something sharpening beneath the grief. "A family whose mother died, was maybe murdered, Damien. The news said there were conspiracy theories about her death for decades, and whose father waited 23 years to look for me. 23 years, and now, suddenly, there's a reward. Suddenly, it's front-page news. Why now? Why not 20 years ago, or 10, or 5? It was the exact question that had been eating at Damien since the moment he'd seen the news broadcast, and he did not yet have an answer, though every instinct he possessed told him that the answer, when it came, would not be a comfortable one. "I don't know," he admitted, "but I promise you, I'm going to find out. Before you meet any of them, before you set one foot near that family, I need to understand what happened 23 years ago and why this reward is happening now. Something about this doesn't sit right with me, Sophia, and I've stayed alive this long by trusting that feeling." "You think they're dangerous?" "I think," Damien said carefully, "that $500 million is a number large enough to make anyone dangerous, family or not." Sophia was quiet for a long moment, looking down at their joined hands. "There's a photograph," she said finally, "in the folder. The doctor left it. A childhood photo they used for comparison. I haven't looked at it yet. I don't know if I'm ready." "You don't have to look at anything tonight," Damien said. "I want to," Sophia said, though her voice shook. "I need to know. I've spent my whole conscious life not knowing anything about who I was before the docs. I can't keep running from it just because I'm scared of what I'll find." She opened the folder with hands that trembled and slid out the photograph. A faded image of a laughing toddler with dark curls, held in the arms of a woman whose face was so achingly familiar it stole the breath from both of them. Standing in front of a Christmas tree in a house that looked like something from a magazine. Sophia stared at the photograph for a long time, tears sliding silently down her face, and Damien understood. Watching her trace the edge of the image with one trembling finger, that he was witnessing the moment a woman finally, after a lifetime of unremembered horror, came face to face with the ghost of who she used to be. "I remember her hands," Sophia whispered. "I don't remember her face, not really, but I remember her hands. She used to braid my hair. I can feel it, the memory of fingers in my hair, but I can't see her face." "Why can't I see her face, Damien?" "I don't know," Damien said gently, pulling her into his arms as the dam finally broke and she wept. Not the careful, guarded tears of a woman afraid of being seen, but the full, unguarded grief of someone finally allowed to mourn a mother she'd never been given the chance to know. But we're going to find out. Everything. I promise you that. He held her long into the night, long after her tears had exhausted themselves into sleep, and stared at the photograph on the desk, at the young mother's haunted, beautiful face, and made a silent vow that would, in the months to come, cost him everything he had ever built. He was going to find out who had really taken Isabel Reyes from that Connecticut estate 23 years ago. He simply did not yet know that the answer was written into his own family's history in blood. The Reyes family received Sophia with the kind of performative warmth Damien had spent his entire life learning to distrust. The estate in Connecticut was a monument to old money, sprawling lawns manicured into submission, a house with more wings than most hotels, security discreet enough to be invisible unless you knew precisely where to look, which Damien did, cataloguing exits and camera positions out of pure professional instinct, even as he walked beside Sophia up the marble steps. Alexander Reyes met them in the foyer, and up close he was smaller than his television presence suggested, silver-haired and precisely dressed, with the particular controlled stillness of a man who had spent decades learning to hide whatever he actually felt behind a mask of civility. "Isabel," he said, and his voice cracked with what looked to any untrained observer like 23 years of grief finally breaking free. He crossed the foyer and pulled Sophia into an embrace that she endured rather than returned, her body rigid, her eyes finding Damien's over her father's shoulder with an expression of barely controlled panic. "Mr. Reyes," Sophia said, extracting herself as gently as she could, "this is a lot. I don't remember you. I don't remember any of this. I need you to understand that." "Of course," Alexander said smoothly, though something flickered behind his eyes that Damien's trained gaze caught and filed away immediately. Not grief exactly, but something closer to calculation. "You were only 3 months old when you were taken. There's no reason you'd remember anything. We have time. All the time in the world, now that you're home." The rest of the family assembled in the drawing room like actors taking their marks. A younger man, Alexander's nephew Julian, all polished charm and expensive watches, who kissed Sophia's hand with a familiarity that made Damien's jaw tighten. A woman named Cordelia, Alexander's sister, whose smile never once reached eyes that assessed Sophia with the cold precision of a jeweller evaluating a stone. And a family lawyer, Mr. Price, who hovered at the edges of every conversation with a leather portfolio he never quite let out of his hands. "We're overjoyed to have you home," Cordelia said, her voice pitched perfectly for warmth, her eyes doing the actual work of measuring Sophia's dress, her posture, the calluses on hands that had clearly known manual labour, cataloguing every detail that marked her as someone who had spent 23 years very far from silver spoons. "I'm sure this is overwhelming," Julian added, his hand lingering a beat too long on Sophia's arm as he guided her to a seat, a gesture Damien catalogued with the same silent fury he'd once reserved for men who touched things that belonged to rival families. "But you're safe now. This is your home. Whatever you need, whatever you want, it's yours." The word yours hung in the air with an emphasis that made Damien's instincts scream. Because in a family whose patriarch had just announced a $500 million reward for his daughter's return, the concept of what's yours was never as simple as it sounded. Not when there was an inheritance the size of the Reyes' fortune sitting unclaimed at the centre of it all. "Mr. Romano," Alexander said, turning his attention to Damien with a smile that didn't reach his eyes, "I understand we owe you an enormous debt of gratitude. My daughter tells me you rescued her from a very dangerous situation." "I did what anyone would have done," Damien said, his voice deliberately flat, giving nothing away. "Not anyone," Alexander said. "Very few men in your position would have risked a war with the Bratva over a woman with no name and no history. I find myself curious about your motivations, Mr. Romano. A man in your line of work doesn't typically concern himself with charity." There it was, the first overt probe, wrapped in courtesy, testing whether Damien was a threat to be managed or an ally to be purchased. Damien had navigated 1,000 conversations exactly like this one, in boardrooms and back rooms across 2 continents, and he recognized the shape of it immediately. "I fell in love with her," Damien said simply, watching the flicker of surprise cross Alexander's face at the directness of the answer. "Before I knew anything about a reward, or an inheritance, or a family searching for her. If that's a problem for you, Mr. Reyes, I'd rather know now than later." Something shifted in the room, a recalibration among the assembled family, an unspoken recognition that the man in front of them was not going to be managed as easily as they'd hoped. Julian's easy charm cooled by several degrees. Cordelia's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. Alexander, to his credit, simply studied Damien for a long moment before nodding slowly. "Then we understand each other," Alexander said. "Isabel's happiness is, of course, our only priority." The lie was so smooth, so practiced, that Damien almost admired it. Almost. That evening, alone in the guest suite the Reyes family had prepared, a room so opulent it made the mansion's own guest quarters look modest, filled with clothes and jewellery apparently purchased in anticipation of her arrival, as though a person could be reconstructed with the right shopping list. Sophia sat on the edge of an enormous bed and stared at her own reflection in a gilded mirror, like she was looking at a stranger. "They're lying to me," she said quietly, when Damien came to check on her. "About something. I don't know what, but I can feel it. The way you feel a draft in a room, even when you can't see where it's coming from." "I felt it too," Damien said. "Every one of them. Your father, your uncle, your aunt. They're performing joy, not feeling it. I've spent my whole life reading rooms full of people who want to kill each other while smiling. I know what I saw down there tonight." "Then why did they call the press conference? Why the reward if they're not happy I'm back?" Damien sat beside her on the bed, his mind already working through the puzzle with the same cold precision he brought to a hostile takeover. "Because they had to," he said slowly. "Because if word got out that Isabel Reyes had been found and the family hadn't publicly celebrated it, it would look suspicious. The reward, the press conference, it's theatre, Sophia. It's insurance. Whatever they're actually afraid of, a public celebration protects them from scrutiny." "Afraid of what?" Damien looked at her, at the daughter of a murdered woman, sitting in a bedroom bought with blood money she didn't yet understand, surrounded by relatives who smiled with their mouths and calculated with their eyes, and felt the first cold certainty of a truth he wasn't ready to voice yet. "I don't know," he lied, because he was beginning to suspect, and the suspicion terrified him more than any enemy he'd ever faced. "But I'm going to find out. And when I do, I need you to trust that whatever it costs, I'll protect you from it." Sophia leaned into him, exhausted, overwhelmed, grieving a mother she'd never known, and now surrounded by a family that felt more dangerous than any warehouse full of traffickers. "Promise me something," she said quietly. "Anything. Promise me you won't let this fortune change what we have. I don't want their money. I never wanted their money. I just wanted to know who I was." "I promise," Damien said, and meant it with every fibre of an empire he was about to burn to the ground to keep that promise. "You're still Sophia to me. You'll always be Sophia to me." He didn't know, holding her in that gilded bedroom while a family of strangers plotted somewhere below them, that his own father's ledger, hidden in a vault Damien hadn't opened in 3 years, held the answer to every question keeping him awake that night. Damien returned to the mansion alone 3 days later, leaving Sophia in the reluctant, watchful care of Marco and 2 of his most trusted men, with instructions that bordered on paranoid: no unfamiliar staff, no meals she hadn't watched being prepared, no meetings without Damien or Marco present. "You think they'd hurt her?" Marco had said before Damien left. "Her own family." "I think," Damien had answered, "that people who inherit $500 million only if a missing heiress is never found don't celebrate when she turns up alive. I want eyes on her every second I'm gone." The vault beneath the Romano estate had not been opened since Damien's father's funeral 3 years earlier. A steel room behind the wine cellar, accessible only by a combination Damien had memorized as a boy and never once had reason to use since inheriting the business. Inside, alongside guns and gold bars and the accumulated evidence of 3 decades of criminal enterprise, sat his father's private ledgers, leather-bound books that recorded, in a code only the Romano bosses had ever been taught to read, the true history of the family's business. Damien had avoided this room for 3 years, telling himself he had no need of ancient history when the present demanded all his attention. Now, with Sophia's face in his mind and a conspiracy he could feel but not yet name pressing against his skull, he pulled the ledgers from their shelf and began, methodically, to read. It took him 6 hours to find it. 6 hours of decoding his father's cramped, coded handwriting, cross-referencing dates and initials and payment amounts that meant nothing until, suddenly, they meant everything. March 1993. A payment of $2 million, routed through 3 shell companies from an account Damien eventually traced, after another 2 hours of frantic cross-referencing, to a holding company owned, at the time, by Alexander Reyes's late business partner, a man named Frederick Vantano. The payment was labelled, in his father's private code, with a single word: Bambina. Baby girl. Damien's hands went cold as he turned the page and found a second entry, 3 months later, in June 1993. A payment received, not sent, of $800,000 from the Reyes estate's own accounts, labelled with a notation that took Damien nearly an hour to decode fully, because it was written not in his father's usual shorthand, but in something closer to a confession, as if some part of Giovanni Romano had needed, even then, to record the truth for his own conscience. C. Reyes discovered the arrangement. Threatens exposure. F.V. insists on permanent solution. I refuse direct involvement, but agree to arrange transport of the child. God forgive me. Damien sat in the cold vault for a long time after reading those words, the ledger open on his knees, understanding with a clarity that felt like a blade through his ribs exactly what his father had done. Alexander Reyes had not lost his daughter to a random kidnapping. He had arranged with his business partner, Frederick Vantano, to have his own infant daughter taken, likely, Damien realized with mounting horror as he read further into the ledger's coded entries, because Catherine Reyes had discovered some financial impropriety in her husband's business, some fraud large enough that her husband and his partner had decided the child, and eventually the mother herself, needed to disappear before Catherine could expose whatever they were hiding. And Giovanni Romano, Damien's own father, the man Damien had spent his entire childhood believing was, whatever his other sins, at least loyal to a code that didn't touch children, had been the one paid to make the infant vanish. The lullaby. The birthmark. The years on the street with no memory of who she'd been. It hadn't been random cruelty that had erased Sophia's past. It had been engineered, an infant handed off through intermediaries, likely placed with a family or an institution that had, at some point Damien couldn't yet trace, failed her so catastrophically that she'd ended up alone, nameless, and eventually captured by traffickers who saw in her exactly what the auctioneer had called her, someone with no family, no history, no one looking for her. Except someone had been looking for her. Her father had spent 23 years pretending to search while actually hoping she'd never be found, until, Damien now suspected, some new crisis had forced his hand, made the public reward and the performance of grief suddenly necessary. Something had changed. Something had made Alexander Reyes need his daughter found, alive, right now, in front of cameras. Damien's phone buzzed. Marco. "Boss, you need to get back here, now." "What happened?" "Nothing happened yet. The Alexander Reyes just showed up unannounced with his lawyer and some paperwork he wants Sophia to sign. Something about a preliminary inheritance agreement. He's saying it needs to happen before some deadline, some legal thing about unclaimed estate provisions. I don't like it, boss. Something about this whole thing stinks." Damien closed the ledger, his blood running cold with a fury he hadn't felt since his father's murder, and understood with the clarity of a man who had just watched his entire understanding of his own family collapse, exactly what kind of trap was closing around the woman he loved. "Don't let her sign anything," Damien said. "I'm coming. And Marco, I need you to pull every file we have on Frederick Vantano. Every deal, every shipment, every dollar that's ever moved between his family and ours. I think we're about to find out why my father's ledgers have a body count no one's ever counted." He gathered the ledger, locked the vault, and drove through the night with a single burning clarity, displacing every other thought in his mind. His own family had stolen Sophia's childhood, had orphaned her before she was old enough to remember her mother's face, had condemned her to 23 years of unremembered horror so that two rich men could protect a fortune built on fraud. And now, if he didn't move fast enough, that same conspiracy, updated, modernized, wearing the mask of a grieving family, was about to finish what it started 23 years ago. He didn't know yet how he would tell Sophia the truth. He only knew, driving through the dark with his father's sins riding shotgun beside him, that the truth was coming, whether either of them was ready for it or not. Damien arrived at the Reyes estate just after midnight, to find the drawing room lit like a stage for a performance he was determined to interrupt. Alexander Reyes sat across from Sophia at a long mahogany table, Mr. Price beside him, with a stack of documents fanned out like a losing hand of cards, and Sophia's face, pale, exhausted, cornered, told Damien everything he needed to know about the pressure that had been applied in his absence. "Mr. Romano," Alexander said, not rising, his composure a thin veneer over something Damien now recognized as pure calculation.
This is a family matter.
"She is not signing anything tonight," Damien said, crossing the room to stand behind Sophia's chair, one hand resting on her shoulder in a gesture that was as much a warning to the room as it was comfort to her. "It's a standard provisional agreement," Mr. Price said smoothly, "protecting Isabel's claim to the estate while the formal identification process concludes. There's a statutory deadline for—" "There's no statutory deadline that requires signing documents at midnight, 3 days after a woman meets her supposed family for the first time in her conscious memory," Damien said, his voice dropping into the register that had ended negotiations far more dangerous than this one. "What's really in that document, Councillor?" A flicker of something crossed Price's face, the specific unease of a lawyer who'd been asked to move faster than his own ethics were entirely comfortable with. "It's a waiver," Sophia said quietly, and every head in the room turned to her. "I read it while I waited for you, Damien. It's not just about protecting my claim. It transfers controlling interest in the Reyes Foundation and the family's shipping holdings to a trust managed by my father and my uncle Julian, in exchange for a lump sum payment to me of $50 million, a fraction of what the estate is actually worth. It's not protecting my inheritance. It's taking it away from me before I even fully understand what I'm entitled to." Damien felt something in his chest go cold and sharp. Admiration and fury tangled together. Admiration for the woman who, despite everything, despite a lifetime of trauma that should have made her an easy target, had read every word of a document designed to exploit her and understood exactly what it meant. "Is that true?" Damien asked, looking directly at Alexander. Alexander's mask slipped, just slightly, enough for Damien to see, for one unguarded second, the calculation underneath. "The estate is complicated," he said. "There are debts, obligations, business partners with legitimate claims on certain assets. This agreement simplifies everything, protects everyone's interests, including Isabel's." "Including your interests most of all," Damien said. "Because if she takes full control of her inheritance, if she demands a proper accounting of the Reyes Foundation, of the shipping holdings, of every transaction made in her absence for the last 23 years, she might find something you'd rather she never see. Isn't that right, Mr. Reyes?" The room went very still. Julian, who had been standing near the window with the practiced ease of a man used to being underestimated, took a step forward, his charm curdling into something sharper. "You should be careful, Romano," Julian said. "You're a guest in this house, and frankly, given who your family is, given what your father did for a living, I'd think twice before lecturing anyone about financial ethics."
It was, Damien realised with a jolt, an accidental confession, the kind of slip made by a man too confident in his own superiority to consider that the criminal he was condescending to might already know exactly what your father did for a living had entailed. "What exactly do you know about my father's business, Julian?" Damien asked very quietly, and watched the younger man's confidence falter as he realised a half-second too late that he'd said more than he meant to. I don't know what you're talking about, Julian said, too fast. I think you do, Damien said. I think you know exactly what arrangement was made in 1993 between my father and Frederick Vantano. I have the ledgers, Julian. I have the payment dated March of that year and the second payment 3 months later, and a confession in my father's own handwriting about arranging transport for a child whose mother had discovered a fraud too large to survive exposure. I think you know precisely what your family paid mine to do. The silence that followed was total. Alexander Reyes had gone the colour of old paper. Cordelia, who had entered the room moments earlier with a tray of coffee she now set down with trembling hands, looked between her brother and her nephew with an expression that suggested she, too, had known for 23 years, and said nothing. "Papa," Sophia said, her voice shaking, the word feeling wrong in her mouth even as she said it. "Is it true? Did you have me taken from my own mother? Did you have her killed?" Alexander's composure finally, completely shattered. "It wasn't supposed to happen this way," he said, his voice raw in a way that sounded, for the first time, genuinely unrehearsed. "Frederick and we'd made investments before you were born, in operations that weren't legitimate. Your mother found the accounts. She was going to go to the authorities. She didn't understand that exposing the fraud would have destroyed everything. The company, the foundation, thousands of jobs. I only meant to have you hidden, temporarily, until she could be reasoned with. I never meant for—" "You never meant for her to die," Sophia finished, her voice hollow with disgust. "But she did die. And you let me disappear for 23 years. You let me be raised by strangers, or by no one at all, until I ended up homeless, being sold at auction like an animal, and you did nothing. You didn't look for me. You waited 23 years and only announced a reward now. Why now, Papa? What changed?" Alexander's silence was, in its own way, the most damning answer of all. "Tell her," Damien said, his voice a blade. "Tell her the truth, or I will. And I promise you, my version will be considerably less flattering." "There's an audit," Alexander said finally, defeated. "The SEC has been investigating irregularities in the Reyes Foundation's accounting for the past 18 months. If Sophia, comes forward with a legitimate claim to the estate, if she demands access to the Foundation's books as her right as an heir, the fraud from 23 years ago will surface along with it." "Her return isn't a gift, Isabel. It's a threat. I needed to control the narrative before the audit forces the truth out anyway. The reward, the press conference, it was meant to buy your loyalty before you learned enough to become dangerous." Sophia stood slowly, her whole body trembling, and Damien moved instantly to her side, his hand finding hers, steadying her against a truth that had just obliterated whatever fragile hope she'd carried into that house. "You didn't want your daughter back," Sophia said, her voice breaking. "You wanted a hostage, a liability you could manage." "Isabel, please, don't call me that," Sophia said, and for the first time since Damien had met her, there was steel in her voice, forged in the fire of a betrayal that went all the way back to her own infancy. "My name is Sophia. Damien gave me that name. And he gave me more love and more truth in 6 months than you've given me in 23 years. I'm leaving. And Mr. Reyes? I want a full forensic audit of every account connected to my mother's death and my disappearance. I want the truth, all of it, no matter what it costs you."
She turned and walked out of that drawing room with Damien at her side, and neither of them looked back at the family that had orchestrated her entire tragedy, that had waited 2 decades to weaponize her return rather than mourn her loss. But as they reached the car, Damien's phone buzzed with a message from Marco that made his blood run cold. "Boss, we have a problem. Frederick Vantano's grandson just put a contract out on Sophia. He knows about the ledger. He knows what you found." The war had just begun. The Vantano crime family had operated in the shadow of the Romanos for 3 generations, a rival organisation built on the same foundations of violence and territorial pride. And Damien had spent most of his adult life maintaining an uneasy truce with them, a truce that shattered the moment his phone buzzed with Marco's warning. "Explain," Damien said, the moment he had Marco on a secure line, driving Sophia back toward Manhattan at speeds that made the Mercedes' engine strain. "Frederick Vantano's dead. Died 2 years ago. Natural causes," Marco said, his voice tight with the particular urgency of a man delivering news he knew his boss wouldn't want to hear. "His grandson, Dominic, runs the family now, and Dominic just made contact with 3 different crews asking about a $500 million problem that needs to disappear before an SEC audit concludes. He's not being subtle about it, boss. He's scared, and scared men make sloppy, dangerous moves." "Why would Dominic Vantano care about the Reyes fraud?" Damien asked, though even as the words left his mouth, he was already assembling the answer, his mind working through the ledger's implications with brutal clarity. "Because his family's fortune is built on the same fraud," Marco said. "I pulled everything we have on Vantano Holdings this afternoon, like you asked. Frederick Vantano didn't just help arrange Isabel Reyes's kidnapping. He laundered the stolen inheritance through a network of shell companies that eventually became the foundation of the entire Vantano shipping empire. If the audit exposes the original fraud, it doesn't just destroy Alexander Reyes, it unravels 3 generations of Vantano wealth. Dominic's not protecting a reputation, boss. He's protecting an empire built on stolen money, and he thinks the only way to save it is to make sure Sophia never testifies to anyone." Damien glanced at Sophia in the passenger seat, her face pale in the dashboard light, and felt something in him harden into the particular cold clarity that had once made him one of the most feared men in a business built on fear. "How much time do we have?" he asked. "I don't know," Marco admitted. "Could be days, could be hours. Dominic's not an idiot. He knows a public hit on a woman connected to your family would start a war he can't win outright. So he's going to try to make it look like an accident, or pin it on someone else entirely. That's what scares me. He's thinking 3 moves ahead." "Get everyone to the safe house in the Catskills," Damien said. "Not the mansion. Dominic will have eyes on the mansion within hours if he doesn't already. I want a full security detail, and I want you personally overseeing the transfer. No exceptions." He ended the call and reached for Sophia's hand, finding it cold and trembling in the dark. "I heard all of that," she said quietly. "This is because of me, because of what I know now." "This is because of what my family did to yours 23 years ago," Damien said, his voice fierce. "None of this is your fault, Sophia. Not one piece of it. You didn't ask to be born into a fraud. You didn't ask to be taken from your mother. And you sure as hell didn't ask to become a threat to 2 crime families protecting stolen money. This is on them, all of it." "And what about your family?" Sophia asked, and there was something raw and wounded in the question, something that had been building since the moment Alexander Reyes had confirmed the ledger's darkest implication.
Your father did this too, Damien. He helped them. He took the payment. He arranged for a mother to be murdered and a baby to disappear. How am I supposed to look at you and not see him? How am I supposed to be in this car with you and not wonder if I'm just repeating my mother's mistake, trusting a Romano man who might, in the end, protect his family's interests over mine? The question landed like a physical blow, because it was fair, because every instinct Damien possessed told him that Sophia had every right to ask it, and because he did not yet have an answer that felt adequate to the size of the betrayal she'd just uncovered. "I can't undo what my father did," Damien said slowly, choosing every word with the care of a man walking across a minefield. "I can't give you back the 23 years he stole from you, or the mother you never got to know. All I can do is show you, every single day, for as long as you'll let me, that I am not him. That when I found out what he did, I didn't bury it to protect the family name. I told you the truth, even knowing it might cost me everything, including you. I need you to believe that's worth something, even if it can never be enough." Sophia was quiet for a long time, watching the dark highway unspool ahead of them, tears sliding silently down her face. "It is worth something," she said finally. "I don't know if it's enough yet. I don't know if I can separate you from what your name means, from what your family did. But I know that you told me the truth when you could have hidden it. I know you drove 3 hours through the night to protect me from a threat you didn't create. That has to count for something, doesn't it?" "It counts for everything to me," Damien said. "But I understand if it's not enough for you. I understand if you need distance from the Romano name entirely, after everything it's cost you." "I don't know what I need," Sophia admitted. "I just know that right now, in this car, with a hitman somewhere out there hunting me because of a fraud that started before I could even remember my own mother's face, right now, you're the only safety I have left in the world. I hate that. I hate that my safety is tied to the same family that destroyed my life. But I don't know how to hate you, Damien. I've tried since Alexander told the truth, and I can't do it." "Then don't try," Damien said. "Just let me protect you. Let me fix what my family broke as much as it can be fixed. And when this is over, when you're safe, when the truth is fully exposed and the people responsible are finally held accountable, if you decide you can't build a life with the son of the man who orphaned you, I'll accept that. I'll let you go, and I won't fight you on it. Because you deserve whatever peace you decide to build, even if it's a peace without me in it." The words cost him more than any negotiation he'd ever conducted, more than any deal he'd ever brokered with his life on the line, because for the first time since the warehouse, Damien Romano was contemplating a future in which he did not have Sophia in his arms, and understanding, with the same clarity that had kept him alive through a decade of war, that if it came to that, he would let her go anyway. Because loving her had taught him that some things mattered more than possession. They drove the rest of the way to the Catskills in silence, her hand in his, the weight of two families' sins pressing down on both of them, neither knowing that Dominic Vantano's hunters were already 3 hours ahead of them on a road that led not to safety, but to an ambush 23 years in the making. The safe house sat at the end of a private road in the Catskills, a fortified cabin disguised as a rustic retreat, surrounded by 200 acres of forest that Damien's security team had turned in the space of 6 hours into a perimeter bristling with hidden cameras and armed men. "We're secure," Marco reported, as Damien walked the perimeter at dawn, unable to sleep, his mind cycling endlessly through the implications of the ledger, the audit, and the war now brewing between two crime families with everything to lose. 12 men on rotation, cameras covering every approach, and I've got eyes on the main road from both directions. Nobody gets within a mile of this place without us knowing. Good, Damien said, though the word felt hollow. 12 men and 200 acres of forest had never felt like enough before, not when the threat was as motivated and as well-funded as Dominic Vantano, a man protecting 3 generations of stolen wealth with everything he had. Inside, Sophia sat by the fireplace, wrapped in a blanket, staring into flames that did little to warm the chill that had settled into her since the confrontation at the Reyes estate. She looked, Damien thought, like the woman he'd carried out of that warehouse 8 months ago, hollowed out, retreated into some internal fortress, protecting herself against a world that had once again proven itself capable of unlimited cruelty. "You should eat something," Damien said, setting a plate beside her. "I keep thinking about her," Sophia said, not moving. "My mother. Catherine. I have a name for her now, a face in a photograph, but I still can't remember anything real. I don't remember her voice, except for that lullaby. I don't remember being held by her. 23 years, Damien, and the only thing she managed to give me before she died was a song I hummed without even knowing why." "That's not nothing," Damien said quietly, sitting beside her. "That song survived everything. The trafficking, the streets, the years without memory. It found its way to you anyway. That's not nothing, Sophia. That's the strongest kind of love there is, the kind that outlasts even memory itself." Sophia turned to look at him, her eyes red-rimmed but clear. "How do you do that?" she asked. "How do you always know exactly what I need to hear?" "I don't," Damien admitted. "I'm terrified most of the time that I'm going to say the wrong thing, that I'm going to fail you, the way everyone else in your life has failed you. But I've learned that loving you means trying anyway, even when I'm scared of getting it wrong." She leaned into him then, and for a while they simply sat together in silence, watching the fire, 2 people carrying the weight of a conspiracy that stretched back before either of them had been born. "What happens now?" Sophia asked eventually. "With the audit? With Dominic Vantano? With everything?" "Now we fight," Damien said. "Properly. I've already reached out to a federal prosecutor I trust, someone who's been building a racketeering case against organized crime networks for years, someone who'll take the ledger and the audit findings seriously if we present them correctly. It's not going to be quick, and it's not going to be safe, but it's the only way to actually end this instead of just surviving one attack at a time." "You'd bring in federal prosecutors against your own business, against everything your family built?" Damien was quiet for a moment, weighing an answer that had been forming in him since the moment he'd read his father's confession in that cold vault. "My family's business was already rotten at its foundation," he said finally. "I told myself for years that the things we did, the drugs, the extortion, even some of the violence, existed in some separate moral category from real evil, because we had rules, because we didn't touch children, because we weren't traffickers or kidnappers. And then I found out my own father helped orchestrate the theft of an infant and the murder of her mother, all to protect a business partner's fraud. There's no clean version of that story, Sophia. There's no way to protect the empire without protecting the lie that stole your entire childhood."
I'm not willing to do that, not even for the family name. You'd give up everything, Sophia said slowly, understanding dawning in her voice. Your entire empire, everything your family built over 3 generations. I'd give up all of it, Damien said, for the truth, for you. I spent 10 years building an empire I told myself I was proud of, and in the space of 1 week, I've learned that the foundation it was built on is soaked in exactly the kind of blood I always told myself I'd never touch. I can't unknow that. I can't keep building on that foundation and still look at myself in the mirror, let alone look at you. Sophia studied him for a long moment, something shifting behind her eyes. Not quite forgiveness, not yet, but the beginning of something that might eventually become it. I don't want you to lose everything because of me, she said quietly. I'm not losing everything because of you, Damien said, cupping her face gently in his hands. I'm choosing to lose an empire I no longer believe in because loving you taught me that some things, truth, justice, the chance to finally give you the peace you deserve, are worth more than any amount of territory or money. That's not a sacrifice, Sophia. That's the first genuinely good decision I've made in 10 years. Outside, the forest around the safe house was utterly silent. The kind of silence that in Damien's experience usually preceded violence rather than peace. He didn't know yet that Dominic Vantano's men were already moving through that silent forest, closing in on the cabin with weapons drawn, prepared to finish in one violent night what Frederick Vantano and Giovanni Romano had started 23 years earlier. He only knew, holding Sophia's face in his hands beside a dying fire, that whatever came next, he was no longer fighting to protect an empire. He was fighting for a family, the only real family he had left in the world. The attack came at 3 a.m. in the dead hour when even trained men's attention drifts, and it came with a coordination that told Damien in the first 3 seconds of gunfire that Dominic Vantano had been planning this for far longer than the few days since the ledger's existence became known. "Contact! North perimeter!" The radio crackled with Marco's voice, tight with adrenaline, as automatic weapons fire shattered the silence of the forest, and Damien was already moving, shoving Sophia toward the reinforced interior room built into the safe house's foundation precisely for this scenario. "Stay here. Do not open this door for anyone but me or Marco. Do you understand?" Damien said, pressing a pistol into her hands with fingers that shook despite 20 years of training. "If anyone else tries to get in, you shoot first and ask nothing later." "Do you understand me, Sophia?" "Damien, I need you to survive this," he said, cutting off whatever protest was forming, his voice cracking with a fear he'd never once shown another living soul. "I need you to survive this so that everything my father took from you actually gets returned. Please, trust me one more time." She nodded, tears streaking her face, and Damien sealed the reinforced door behind him and ran into a night that had erupted into chaos. The firefight lasted 11 minutes, though it felt to every man involved like hours. Damien's security detail, 12 men, hardened by years in an organization that treated violence as an occupational hazard rather than an exception, fought with the disciplined ferocity of men defending something they understood to be sacred. And Dominic Vantano's hired guns,
Mercenaries recruited hastily and paid well, but without the deeper loyalty that came from genuine devotion, eventually broke. Damien took a bullet through the shoulder in the 8th minute, a graze that tore through muscle and left him bleeding freely but functional. Adrenaline burning through the pain as he put down 2 of Vantano's men with a precision born of a decade spent surviving exactly this kind of violence. Marco took a worse hit, a round through the thigh that dropped him to the ground, though he kept firing even as he fell, covering the retreat of 2 younger men who'd frozen at the sudden reality of combat. By the time the forest went quiet again, 4 of Vantano's mercenaries lay dead in the snow. 2 more had fled into the tree line, and Damien's own men had suffered Marco's leg wound and a graze to Damien's shoulder as the worst of their casualties, a result that felt, in the immediate aftermath, like a miracle rather than a victory. Damien burst back into the safe house, blood soaking through his shirt, and pounded on the reinforced door. "Sophia, it's me, it's Damien, open the door!" The door opened to reveal Sophia standing with the pistol gripped in both trembling hands, exactly where he'd left her, exactly as instructed, and the moment she saw the blood on his shoulder, she dropped the gun entirely and threw herself into his arms with a force that made his wound scream in protest. "You're hurt," she said, her hands frantically searching the wound, pressing against the bleeding with an instinctive urgency that surprised them both. "Oh God, Damien, we're bleeding. We need to—" "I'm fine," Damien said, though the paleness of his face suggested otherwise. "It's a graze. I've had worse. Marco's hurt worse than me. We need to get him to the doctor." They spent the next hour in controlled chaos, Damien's private physician, summoned by helicopter, stitching Marco's leg on the kitchen table, while another medic dressed Damien's shoulder, and Sophia moved between the wounded with a steadiness that belied the terror she'd endured, holding Marco's hand while he cursed through the stitching, pressing a cool cloth to Damien's forehead when his own adrenaline finally crashed and left him shaking with delayed shock. "You didn't leave the room," Damien said later, once the immediate crisis had passed, once Marco was stable and sleeping off a dose of morphine, and the forest outside had been swept clean of any remaining threat. "Even with gunfire 50 yards away, even not knowing if I was alive or dead out there, you stayed exactly where I told you to stay." "I trusted you," Sophia said simply. "You told me to stay, and you told me why. And I believed you. Is that strange?" "It's the least strange thing that's happened to me in a week," Damien said. And something in his exhausted, blood-loss hazy voice made Sophia laugh. A small, startled sound, half sob and half genuine amusement, the kind of laughter that comes only after surviving something that should have killed you. "We could have died tonight," she said, sobering. "We could have," Damien agreed. "And if we had, if this had ended tonight, in a forest in the Catskills, with Vantano's men finishing what my father started, I want you to know that every single day since the warehouse has been worth it to me. Every risk, every threat, every piece of my old life I'm about to lose. I would do all of it again, exactly the same way, just to have had these months with you." Sophia was quiet for a moment, studying his face in the low light of the cabin's kitchen, blood-stained and exhausted, and more honest than she had ever seen a human being look. "I love you," she said. "I don't know how to reconcile that with everything your family did to mine. I don't know if that reconciliation is even possible. But I know that tonight, when the gunfire started, the only thought in my head, the only thing I actually cared about, was whether you were going to walk back through that door, alive. That has to mean something." "It means everything," Damien said, and kissed her then,
gently, careful of his wound, careful of the exhaustion pulling at both of them, a kiss that tasted of copper and smoke and a fragile, hard-won hope that neither of them fully believed they were allowed to have. Outside, in the grey light before dawn, the first satellite trucks were already arriving at the base of the mountain road, because word of a shootout involving the Romano crime family had reached a local news station faster than either Damien or Sophia could have anticipated. And the story that would soon dominate every headline in the country was about to force both of their hands far sooner than either was ready for. By the time Damien and Sophia returned to the city 3 days later, the story had already metastasized into a media frenzy neither of them was prepared for. "Missing heiress survives Mafia shootout," screamed one headline. "Is Isabel Reyes engaged to a crime boss?" asked another, beneath a paparazzi photograph taken with a long lens from some vantage point Damien's security had missed, of Sophia leaning against him outside the Catskills safe house, his arm bandaged, her face streaked with exhaustion, and something that looked, to the invasive eye of the camera, unmistakably like love. "They've turned this into entertainment," Sophia said bitterly, scrolling through her phone in the back of the armoured car as they made their way to the federal prosecutor's office in downtown Manhattan. "My mother's murder, my kidnapping, it's all just content to them." "That's the world you were born into," Damien said grimly, "whether you wanted it or not. The Reyes name comes with visibility, and visibility comes with vultures." The meeting with U.S. Attorney Elena Marsh, no relation to Damien's housekeeper, a coincidence that had made Sophia smile despite everything, the first genuine smile in days, took 4 hours, during which Damien laid out the entirety of his father's ledger, cross-referenced against banking records his own forensic accountants had spent 72 sleepless hours compiling, painting a picture of fraud and murder that spanned 23 years and implicated not just Alexander Reyes and the late Frederick Vantano, but a network of complicit politicians and financial regulators who had been paid over 2 decades to look away from irregularities in the Reyes Foundation's books. "This is enormous," Marsh said, studying the documents with the particular focused intensity of a prosecutor who understood she was looking at the case of her career. "If even half of this holds up under scrutiny, we're talking about racketeering charges, conspiracy to commit murder, financial fraud spanning multiple jurisdictions. Mr. Romano, I need to ask, you understand that providing this evidence implicates your own father and, by extension, potentially exposes your own organization to scrutiny it might not survive?" "I understand exactly what I'm doing," Damien said. "I'm not asking for immunity for myself, and I'm not asking you to look the other way at whatever else you find in the course of this investigation regarding the Romano family's other activities. I'm asking you to prosecute this case fully and fairly wherever the evidence leads, including if it leads back to me." Marsh studied him for a long moment. "That's an unusual position for a man in your line of work." "I'm not the same man I was 8 months ago," Damien said, glancing at Sophia beside him. "I've done things in my life I'm not proud of, but I refuse to be complicit in covering up what my father did to her, whatever it costs me." Sophia's testimony, delivered over the following 2 days in careful, methodical sessions with federal investigators, filled in gaps the ledger alone couldn't answer. Fragmentary memories she'd never been able to place until now, suddenly finding context. A woman's voice she now understood belonged to Catherine, singing that lullaby in a nursery she couldn't fully picture. The vague, dreamlike sense memory of being handed between strangers as an infant passed through a chain of intermediaries that eventually, tragically, failed to place her with any stable family at all, leaving her to age out of an unregulated foster placement and onto the streets by the time she was 16, with no memory of anything before, no papers, no identity. Nothing but a face and a birthmark that had, by cruel coincidence, or perhaps cruel design, eventually crossed paths with traffickers who saw only an opportunity in her anonymity. "I want to understand something," Sophia said to Marsh, near the end of the second day, her voice steady despite the exhaustion evident in the shadows beneath her eyes. "If this case succeeds, if my father and Julian and whoever else was involved actually face justice, what happens to the money? The inheritance, the foundation, all of it?" "That's complicated," Marsh admitted. "If the fraud is proven, a significant portion of the Reyes fortune could be subject to forfeiture or redirected toward restitution, including, potentially, to you as the primary victim of the original crime and Catherine Reyes's rightful heir." "I don't want it," Sophia said, and the flatness of her certainty surprised even Marsh. "Not the way it currently exists. If there's money that can be recovered, I want it used to fund something real. Support for trafficking survivors, resources for people aging out of foster care with no family to catch them. Exactly the kind of person I was before Damien found me. I don't want to build a life on the same fortune that was built on my mother's murder. I want to build something that actually helps people, like the person I used to be." Damien, sitting beside her, felt something in his chest swell with a pride so fierce it nearly took his breath away. Because in that moment, watching Sophia articulate a vision for justice that had nothing to do with personal enrichment and everything to do with genuine restitution, he understood, more clearly than ever, exactly why he had fallen in love with her in the first place. That night, back at a heavily guarded hotel suite, the mansion no longer safe, the Catskills cabin compromised, every location Damien owned now potentially known to whatever remained of Dominic Vantano's network. Sophia stood at the window overlooking the city lights and finally allowed herself to cry for the mother she'd never gotten to know. "I keep thinking about what she must have felt," Sophia said, as Damien racked his arms around her from behind, careful of his healing shoulder. "In those last months before she died, knowing something was wrong, trying to protect me, and then losing me anyway. And then dying alone, with everyone believing it was suicide, when it might have been." "We're going to find out exactly what happened to her," Damien said. "The forensic team is already reviewing the original case file. If there's evidence her death wasn't a suicide, we'll find it." "And if we find it," Sophia said quietly, "what happens to your family's name? What happens to you, Damien? You've handed over evidence that implicates your own father in a murder conspiracy. Once this becomes public, once the world knows the full story, you're not just losing an empire. You're losing your family's entire legacy, everything your name used to mean." Damien turned her gently to face him, his thumb brushing away her tears with a tenderness that had once seemed impossible for a man like him. "My family's legacy was never something worth protecting," he said. "Not really. Not once I understood what it actually cost. I'd rather have no legacy at all than a legacy built on your mother's blood." Neither of them knew, as they stood together at that window, that Dominic Vantano, cornered, desperate, watching his own empire's foundation crumble in real time as the federal investigation gained momentum,
had already begun making calls to men far more dangerous than the mercenaries who'd failed in the Catskills. Men willing to attack not in a forest at midnight, but in broad daylight, in the heart of the city, in front of the entire world. Marco had been with Damien since childhood, the two of them running errands for Giovanni Romano before either was old enough to shave. Forged into brotherhood through a shared childhood in an organization that had raised them both to believe blood loyalty was the only currency that mattered. Which was why, when Marco's name appeared on a list of phone numbers pulled from Dominic Vantano's seized communications 3 days after the ambush, Damien's first reaction was disbelief so total it took him a full minute to process what the federal analyst was actually telling him. "There has to be a mistake," Damien said, staring at the phone records spread across Elena Marsh's desk. "Marco took a bullet protecting Sophia in that forest. He's been at my side for 20 years. The call started 6 weeks before the Catskills ambush," the analyst said, not unkindly, understanding exactly how this kind of revelation landed on a man like Damien. "Encrypted, but we cracked the protocol. 3 calls to a burner phone traced to Dominic Vantano's inner circle, all placed the night before major decisions in your organization, including the night before you moved Sophia to the safe house." Damien felt the floor shift beneath him in a way that 10 years of running an empire built on betrayal had never quite prepared him for. Because this wasn't a rival capo or a disgruntled soldier. This was Marco, the man who had held Damien's hand at his father's funeral, who had stood beside him through every war and every negotiation, who had taken a bullet in a forest defending the woman Damien loved. He confronted Marco that evening, in the hospital room where his oldest friend was still recovering from the leg wound, and watched, with a grief that felt almost physical, the exact moment Marco understood he'd been discovered. "How much?" Damien asked, his voice flat, controlled in the specific way that terrified people who knew him well. Marco didn't insult either of them by pretending confusion. 2 million, he said quietly. "Dominic came to me 8 weeks ago. Said if I gave him information, just information, boss, nothing more, just where you were moving her and when, he'd let everything else play out naturally. He said he wasn't going to hurt her. Not really. Just needed leverage to make the Reyes situation go away quietly." "You knew he was sending men to kill her," Damien said. "You knew, and you let it happen anyway. You took a bullet in that forest performing loyalty you'd already sold." "I didn't know it would go that far," Marco said, and for the first time in 20 years, Damien heard genuine shame in his voice. "I have a daughter, Damien. She needs surgery, a kind of surgery insurance won't cover, and $2 million. I told myself it was just information, that you'd never even notice, that nothing would actually happen to her. I was wrong. I know I was wrong. And when the shooting started, I made sure I was in the worst position, taking the risk, because some part of me wanted to prove I hadn't really betrayed you. It doesn't excuse anything, I know that." Damien sat with that confession for a long moment, feeling something in his chest that was equal parts fury and grief. Because he understood, in a way that surprised him, the particular desperation of a father willing to sell his loyalty to save his child. Even as he understood, with equal clarity, that Marco's betrayal had nearly cost Sophia her life. "Your daughter's surgery will be paid for," Damien said finally. "Not because I forgive you. I don't know if I ever will. But because she's innocent in this. And I'm not in the business of punishing children for their father's sins anymore. That ends today, in every direction, starting with my own family's history." "What happens to me?" Marco asked.
You're done, Damien said. Not dead. I'm not my father, and I'm not the man I used to be either. But you're done in this organization, done in this life. You'll disappear somewhere far from New York, somewhere Dominic Vantano's enemies can't find you either, and you'll never contact me again. That's the mercy I'm offering you, Marco. Take it or don't. But we're finished. Marco's eyes filled with tears. Grief, shame, gratitude tangled together into something neither man had language for. I'm sorry, he said. For what it's worth, which I know isn't much. I'm sorry, Damien. I know, Damien said, and left the hospital room without looking back, carrying a grief that felt, in its own way, as heavy as everything else he'd lost that week. He told Sophia everything that night, unable to bring himself to hide even the parts that made him look weak, made him look like a man who'd trusted the wrong person for 20 years and nearly paid for it with her life. I should have seen it, Damien said, sitting on the edge of the hotel bed, his head in his hands. 20 years, Sophia, and I never once suspected. What kind of leader misses something like that? A human one, Sophia said gently, sitting beside him, her hand finding his back in slow, steadying circles. Damien, you've spent your entire life being the person everyone else depends on for strength. You don't have to be infallible for me to love you. You just have to keep being honest, the way you've been honest with me since the day you told me about the ledger, even when the truth cost you everything. It did cost me everything, Damien said. Marco was the last piece of my old life I trusted completely. Now he's gone too. You still have me, Sophia said quietly. For as long as you want me. I know that's not the same as 20 years of brotherhood, but it's not nothing either. Damien looked up at her, at the woman who had survived trafficking and homelessness and the shattering revelation of her own stolen identity, and who was now, somehow, offering him comfort in the wake of his own betrayal. It's everything, he said. You're everything, Sophia. I don't know how I got so lucky, in the middle of losing everything else, to still have you. He didn't know, holding her that night, that Dominic Vantano, having lost his inside source, having failed in the forest, having watched the federal investigation gain unstoppable momentum, was about to make one final, desperate move, one that would bring the war directly to the one place Damien had never imagined it would reach. The courtroom itself. The call came at 6 a.m, 3 weeks after Marco's exile, and it was not the news Damien expected. Mr. Romano, this is Detective Reyes with NYPD, and no relation to Alexander Reyes, before you ask, the voice on the phone said, weary and clipped in the particular way of a cop delivering news he already knew would ignite chaos. We need you to come down to the precinct. There has been a development in the Vantano investigation, and your name has come up in a way I think you'll want to address directly. The development, Damien learned upon arrival, was a body. Frederick Vantano's former accountant, a man named Harold Kessler, who had spent 30 years managing the Vantano family's laundering operations, found dead in his Westchester home the previous night. A single gunshot wound, consistent with an execution rather than a suicide, despite the staged scene designed to suggest otherwise. We found a burner phone at the scene, Detective Reyes said, sliding a folder across the interrogation table. Text messages between the phone and a number registered to one of your known associates, discussing a meeting time and location that matches Kessler's time of death almost exactly. Damien's blood ran cold as he read the messages. Crude, damning, clearly designed to implicate him in a murder he had no knowledge of, no involvement in, and every reason to believe was orchestrated specifically to derail the federal case just as it was building unstoppable momentum. "This is a setup," Damien said, his voice controlled, despite the fury building beneath his composure. "I didn't send these messages. I've never even met Harold Kessler."
"That may be true," Detective Reyes said, not unkindly, "but the phone's registered to a shell company connected to your organization, and right now, that's enough for the district attorney to want to bring you in for questioning. Given the ongoing federal investigation into the Reyes and Vantano families, this looks, and I think you understand exactly how bad this looks, like a mob boss silencing a witness who could testify against the very people you claim to be helping prosecute." Damien understood immediately what was happening. Dominic Vantano, cornered and desperate, had found a way to kill two birds with one execution, eliminating Kessler, a man who apparently knew enough about the original 1993 fraud to be dangerous as a witness, while simultaneously framing Damien for the murder, discrediting the very evidence Damien had spent weeks helping the federal prosecutor build.
"I need to call my lawyer," Damien said. "And I need you to understand that whatever evidence you think you have against me is manufactured. Check the timeline of that burner phone's activation. Check whether I have any documented connection to that shell company beyond a name someone else attached to it after the fact. This is exactly the kind of frame a man like Dominic Vantano would orchestrate to discredit the entire federal case." The next 72 hours were the most harrowing of Damien's life since the night he'd carried Sophia out of that warehouse. He was arrested, arraigned, and held without bail pending a hearing, the media frenzy around the story reaching a fever pitch that made the earlier coverage of Sophia's rescue look like a footnote. "Mafia boss arrested for witness murder," every headline screamed. The narrative of a redeemed criminal turned back into simply a criminal, exactly as Dominic Vantano had intended. Sophia visited him in the detention facility on the second day, her face pale but resolute, and the sight of her walking through that sterile visitation room, refusing the fear that had once defined her, filled Damien with a fierce, complicated pride, even in the depths of his own crisis. "I know you didn't do this," she said, her hand pressed flat against the glass separating them, an old-fashioned barrier in a facility that hadn't updated its visitation protocols in decades. "I don't need to ask you. I already know." "How can you be so certain?" Damien asked. "You've known me 8 months, Sophia. My family's entire legacy is built on exactly this kind of violence. Because I've watched you choose truth over self-preservation every single time it mattered," Sophia said. "I watched you hand over evidence that implicated your own father. I watched you exile your oldest friend instead of having him killed for betraying you, even though every instinct in this business you were raised in would have told you that was the safer choice. You're not the man who executes a witness to protect himself, Damien. You're the man who burns his own empire down rather than let a lie stand. I know the difference now. I've learned it from watching you." "I need you to be careful," Damien said, his voice urgent despite the glass and the guards and the recorded phone line between them. "Dominic Vantano is getting desperate, which makes him more dangerous, not less. If he's willing to frame me for murder to derail this case, he's willing to do far worse to you if he thinks it'll make the whole investigation collapse." "I'm not going anywhere," Sophia said, "and I'm not staying quiet either. I've already given a statement to the press, Damien, about you, about everything you've done since the day you carried me out of that warehouse. The world needs to understand who you actually are, not the caricature Dominic Vantano is trying to paint." She was true to her word. Over the following days, as Damien's lawyers worked to expose the manufactured evidence against him, ultimately proving through a forensic analysis of the burner phone's cell tower data that Damien had been 300 miles away in Connecticut at the exact time the incriminating messages were supposedly sent from a phone in his possession, Sophia became, unexpectedly, the public face of his defense. She gave interviews. She spoke with a composure that stunned everyone who'd followed her story since the initial rescue, about trafficking survival, about family betrayal, about a man who had risked everything, including his own freedom, to expose a conspiracy that had stolen her entire childhood. The charges against Damien were dropped 11 days after his arrest, the manufactured evidence unravelling under forensic scrutiny that revealed Dominic Vantano's fingerprints, figuratively and in one critical piece of evidence, literally, all over the frame job. But by the time Damien walked out of that detention facility a free man, Dominic Vantano had already fled the country, and the federal case, though strengthened by the failed frame job's exposure, had lost its most crucial pending witness in Kessler's murder, and Alexander Reyes, sensing an opportunity in the chaos, had begun mounting his own counteroffensive, one designed to discredit Sophia's claim entirely and bury the truth once and for all. Alexander Reyes had spent 23 years learning how to survive scandal. And the campaign he launched in the wake of Damien's arrest and release was, Damien had to admit with grudging professional respect, a masterwork of reputation warfare. Within a week, a series of anonymous sources, later traced though never definitively proven to Reyes's own public relations firm, began feeding stories to friendly media outlets questioning Sophia's mental competency, suggesting that a woman who had suffered years of trauma and memory loss might be an unreliable narrator of her own history, easily manipulated by a criminal boyfriend with obvious financial motives to discredit the Reyes family and seize control of a $500 million fortune through the courts. "They're painting me as either crazy or a puppet," Sophia said, reading the latest headline with a controlled fury that had replaced the fear she once wore like armour. "Both, actually, depending on which article you read." "It's a classic play," Damien said grimly, reviewing the media strategy with the same analytical precision he'd once applied to hostile takeovers. "Discredit the witness before she can testify. Reyes knows the ledger and the forensic accounting are damning, but if he can convince a jury, or more importantly the public, that you're either unstable or being manipulated, he weakens the entire case before it reaches trial." Can he actually do that? Legally? "He's already trying," Damien said. "His lawyers filed a motion yesterday requesting a psychiatric evaluation to determine your competency to provide testimony, citing your documented history of trauma-induced memory loss and dissociative episodes. It's designed to humiliate you publicly and cast doubt on everything you've said, all under the guise of due process." Sophia's jaw tightened, but instead of the retreat Damien half expected, the old instinct to disappear rather than face confrontation, she squared her shoulders in the exact way she had the night he'd first taken her to Vesper, the way of a woman who had learned, through months of painstaking healing, that retreat had never once made anything better. "Let them evaluate me," she said. "I'll pass any competency evaluation they want to throw at me. And when I do, it'll expose exactly what this motion actually is. Not a genuine concern for my well-being, but a desperate attempt to discredit a witness they're terrified of. The psychiatric evaluation, conducted 3 weeks later by a court-appointed specialist with an unimpeachable reputation for independence, took 9 hours across 2 days, and Sophia, who had spent the better part of a year learning to voice a past she could barely remember, answered every question with a clarity and self-awareness that stunned even Damien, who had watched her transformation from the very beginning.
She's one of the most psychologically resilient survivors of extended trauma I've evaluated in 20 years of practice, the specialist wrote in her final report, a conclusion that detonated Alexander Reyes's entire strategy, and, in an ironic twist that Damien couldn't help but appreciate, generated a wave of public sympathy for Sophia that outstripped anything Reyes's PR firm could counter. But Reyes was not finished. 2 weeks after the failed competency motion, a new piece surfaced. A supposed childhood friend of Isabel Reyes's, a woman named Priscilla Ford, who claimed to have information proving that the woman calling herself Sophia was in fact an elaborate fraud. A homeless woman who had learned details of the Reyes case and manipulated DNA testing through connections to organized crime.
"It's absurd," Damien said when the story broke, watching Sophia's face carefully for signs of the old fear returning. "DNA doesn't lie, and there's no mechanism by which anyone could manipulate a federally supervised paternity test. This is a smear campaign, nothing more." "I know," Sophia said, though her voice carried a weariness that worried him more than outright panic would have. I'm so tired, Damien. Every time I think we've reached the bottom of what this family is willing to do to protect their money, they find something new. How many more lies do I have to survive before this is over?" "As many as it takes," Damien said, pulling her into his arms. "I promise you, Sophia, we're close. The federal case is airtight."
Alexander Reyes is running out of moves, and everyone who matters, the prosecutors, the judge, the public, can see exactly what he's doing. This is the last desperate gasp of a man who knows he's about to lose everything. He was right, though neither of them could have predicted how the endgame would actually unfold. 2 days later, Priscilla Ford, under intense scrutiny from investigative journalists who'd begun digging into her own background, collapsed her own story, admitting under questioning that she had been paid $40,000 by an intermediary connected to Alexander Reyes's personal attorney to fabricate the entire account. The confession, recorded and later played for a grand jury, became the single most damaging piece of evidence in the entire case, not because it discredited Sophia, but because it proved definitively and publicly that Alexander Reyes was actively engaged in a criminal conspiracy to obstruct justice, on top of everything else he'd already been implicated in. "He's finished," Elena Marsh told Damien and Sophia in a meeting at her office 3 days after Ford's confession became public. Between the original ledger evidence, the forensic accounting on the Foundation's books, and now direct evidence of witness tampering and obstruction, we're prepared to move forward with a full indictment. Alexander Reyes, Julian Reyes, and Cordelia Reyes will all face charges. It's not going to be quick. Cases like this take years to fully resolve. But the evidence is, at this point, essentially indefensible.
Sophia sat in stunned silence for a long moment, processing the news that the family who had orchestrated her entire tragedy was finally, after 23 years, about to face genuine consequences. "What about my mother's death?" she asked quietly. "Will we ever really know what happened to her?" Marsh's expression softened.
"We found something in the forensic accounting that I think you need to see,"
she said, sliding a new folder across the desk.
A financial transaction, dated the week before Catherine Reyes's death, that suggests her suicide was staged to look like she'd left behind evidence of embezzlement of her own. A final act of character assassination to ensure that even in death, she couldn't be believed if any part of the truth ever surfaced. We're treating her death as a homicide investigation now, reopened after 23 years. Sophia's hands trembled as she opened the folder, and Damien watched her read through documents that finally, after a lifetime of unremembered horror, promised her mother the justice she had died seeking. "She was murdered," Sophia whispered, "because she wouldn't stay quiet about the fraud, because she tried to protect me." "Yes," Marsh said gently, "and we're going to make sure the men responsible finally answer for it. All of it." Damien took Sophia's hand as she wept. Grief and vindication tangled together into something that finally, after everything, felt like the beginning of peace, and understood that the war was nearly won. But he did not yet know that Alexander Reyes, cornered and facing the total destruction of everything he'd spent 2 decades protecting, had one final card left to play. A card that would bring the entire conspiracy and Damien's own fate into a courtroom before the eyes of the entire nation. The trial began on a bright morning in early spring, 8 months after Damien had carried a nameless woman out of a trafficking warehouse, and the courthouse steps were mobbed with a press presence so dense that federal marshals had to clear a path simply to get Sophia and Damien through the doors. Alexander Reyes sat at the defense table with the composed dignity of a man who had spent his entire life believing that money and connections could purchase escape from any consequence, flanked by a legal team that had cost, by Damien's rough estimate, more than most people earned in a lifetime. Julian sat beside him, his earlier charm entirely evaporated, replaced by the hollow-eyed stare of a man watching his entire future collapse in real time. Cordelia had taken a plea deal 3 weeks earlier, testifying against her brother and nephew in exchange for a reduced sentence, her testimony providing the prosecution with an insider's account of exactly how the conspiracy had operated for 23 years. Sophia took the stand on the 3rd day of trial, and Damien watched from the gallery with his heart in his throat as she settled into the witness chair, her posture steady, her eyes clear, a woman who had travelled an impossible distance from the terrified figure he'd carried out of that warehouse. "Miss Reyes," the prosecutor began, "can you describe for the court what you experienced in the years before Damien Romano found you?" Sophia spoke for nearly an hour, her voice steady even as she described things that made several jurors visibly fight tears. Years on the street with no memory of who she was. The particular vulnerability of a woman with no name and no history to protect her. The trafficking network that had eventually captured her and nearly sold her at that warehouse auction. She spoke of nightmares she couldn't explain, of a lullaby that haunted her sleep, of the crushing loneliness of existing without any anchor to a past that had been deliberately, cruelly erased. "And when did you first learn the truth about your identity?" the prosecutor asked. "When Damien Romano saw the news broadcast about the reward for my return," Sophia said, "and recognized the birthmark and the lullaby." He could have said nothing. He could have kept me hidden, kept the reward for himself, kept me as I was. Instead, he told me the truth immediately, even though he had no idea yet what that truth would cost him. The defense's cross-examination, conducted by Alexander Reyes's lead attorney, attempted repeatedly to suggest that Sophia's testimony had been coached or influenced by Damien's own financial interests.
But every attempt collapsed under the weight of Sophia's calm, unwavering clarity, a woman who had, in the months since her rescue, become far too resilient to be shaken by courtroom theatrics. The most devastating testimony, however, came not from Sophia, but from Damien himself, called to the stand on the 5th day of trial to present the ledger evidence directly. Mr.
Romano, the prosecutor said, can you explain to the court why you chose to hand over evidence that directly implicates your own father in a conspiracy to commit kidnapping and murder? Damien looked out at the courtroom, at the reporters furiously scribbling notes, at Alexander Reyes's carefully neutral expression, at Sophia sitting in the gallery with tears already forming in her eyes, and answered with a conviction that would, by that evening, be quoted on every news broadcast in the country. Because I fell in love with a woman who deserved to know the truth about her own life, Damien said, and because I discovered that my family's entire legacy, everything I inherited, everything I was raised to protect, was built partly on the murder of an innocent woman and the theft of her infant daughter's entire childhood. I could have buried that ledger. I could have protected my father's name, protected my own organization, protected the life I'd built. Instead, I chose to protect the truth, because I've learned that a life built on a lie, no matter how comfortable, isn't a life worth protecting. And what has this decision cost you personally, Mr. Romano? Everything, Damien said simply. My organization has effectively dissolved in the wake of this investigation. Rival families have moved into territory the Romano family once controlled, and I've made no effort to reclaim it. Federal investigators are examining my own business's activities as a natural consequence of this case, and I've cooperated fully, understanding that I may face consequences of my own for things my organization did before I chose this path. I've lost my oldest friend, who betrayed us both for money, I understand. Even now, he needed to save his daughter's life. I've lost the empire my family spent 3 generations building. But I've gained something I never expected to have. The chance to help the woman I love find the truth and the justice she was denied for 23 years. If that cost is everything I built, I'd pay it again without hesitation. The courtroom was silent for a long moment after Damien finished speaking, and even the judge, a woman who had presided over organized crime trials for 2 decades and had, by all accounts, seen every kind of testimony imaginable, seemed visibly moved by the raw honesty of a man whose entire life had been built on calculated distance, now standing exposed and unguarded in front of the world. The trial continued for another 11 days, building an overwhelming case against Alexander Reyes and Julian that culminated on the 16th day in a verdict that felt to everyone in that courtroom like the closing of a wound 23 years in the making. Guilty on every count. Alexander Reyes was sentenced to 40 years in federal prison for conspiracy to commit murder, kidnapping, wire fraud, and witness tampering, a sentence that, given his age, amounted to a life sentence in all but name. Julian received 22 years for his role in the ongoing fraud and his involvement in the attempted intimidation campaign against Sophia. Cordelia, in exchange for her cooperation, received 5 years, most of which would be served in a minimum security facility. Sophia stood outside the courthouse afterward, surrounded by a wall of cameras and reporters shouting questions, and Damien watched her take a breath. The same kind of breath she'd taken before walking into Vesper for the first time, before facing her family for the first time. The breath of a woman who had learned, through an entire year of impossible trials,
that she no longer had to be afraid of her own voice. For 23 years, Sophia said, her voice carrying clearly over the assembled press, I didn't know who I was. I lived without a name, without a family, without a single memory of the mother who loved me enough to sing me a lullaby I carried with me even when I'd forgotten everything else. Today, this family finally answered for what they did to her, and to me.
But I want the world to understand something important. The man who actually gave me my life back isn't sitting in a prison cell today. He's standing right here, and he sacrificed everything he had, his fortune, his empire, his own freedom, to make sure I got the truth and the justice I deserved. That's the man I choose, not the family that stole my childhood to protect their money, the man who gave up everything to protect my future. She turned and found Damien's eyes across the crowd, and in front of every camera, every reporter, every person watching from every corner of the country who had followed this story since the first headline broke, Sophia crossed the distance between them and kissed him. A public declaration more powerful than any legal verdict, a choice made in full view of the world that no fortune, no family name, no amount of inherited wealth could ever compete with.
The months following the trial brought a different kind of reckoning. Quieter, slower, but no less transformative than the courtroom drama that had captivated the nation. Damien's own legal exposure, the natural consequence of a federal investigation that had inevitably turned its attention toward the broader activities of the Romano organization, resulted in a plea agreement negotiated over painstaking weeks with Elena Marsh's office. An agreement that acknowledged Damien's extensive cooperation, his role in exposing a decades-old conspiracy that had claimed a life and stolen a childhood, and his complete withdrawal from organized crime in exchange for a sentence of probation and community service, rather than the years of imprisonment his lawyers had initially feared. You could have fought harder for a better deal, his attorney told him, somewhat bewildered by Damien's insistence on accepting responsibility rather than pursuing every possible legal avenue for leniency. Given your cooperation, given the public sympathy for your role in this case, we could have negotiated immunity entirely. I don't want immunity, Damien said. I ran an organization that hurt people for years before I met Sophia. I'm not interested in pretending that never happened just because the ending of this particular story worked out in my favor. I'll take whatever consequences are fair. That's the whole point of what I've been trying to do. The Romano Empire, stripped of its leaders' willingness to defend it, dissolved with a speed that surprised even Damien. Rival families absorbed the shipping routes and the territorial holdings within months. The Vespa nightclub was sold to a legitimate hospitality group at a fraction of its former value, and the mansion on the hill, the place where Sophia had first learned to trust again, was the only piece of the old empire Damien refused to relinquish. I want to keep the vineyard, he told Sophia, as they walked the same rows where she'd once hummed him a half-remembered lullaby. Not because it was my father's, but because it's where I fell in love with you. Everything else I'm happy to let go, but not this. Sophia had used a portion of the recovered restitution, funds clawed back from the Reyes' fortune through the forfeiture process, funds she had insisted, exactly as she'd told Elena Marsh at the very beginning of the case, be redirected toward genuine restitution rather than personal enrichment, to establish the Catherine Foundation, named for the mother she had never gotten to know, an organisation dedicated to supporting survivors of human trafficking and young people ageing out of foster care with no family safety net to catch them. It's not enough to just survive what happened to me, Sophia said at the Foundation's opening ceremony, held not in some glittering Manhattan ballroom, but in a converted community centre in the Bronx, close to the streets where she'd once slept without a name to call her own.
Surviving isn't the whole story. The real victory is making sure fewer people have to survive what I survived at all. Damien stood at the back of that ceremony, watching the woman he loved speak with a confidence and clarity that had been unimaginable in the terrified figure he'd carried out of a warehouse over a year earlier, and felt a pride so complete it nearly brought him to his knees. But healing, they both learned, was not a single triumphant moment. It was a long, uneven road with its own setbacks and small terrors. Sophia still woke, some nights, from nightmares that had nothing to do with the Reyes conspiracy and everything to do with years of trauma that predated even her time on the street, fragments of abuse from foster placements that had failed her, memories that surfaced slowly, painfully, in therapy sessions she attended twice a week with a trauma specialist Damien had found through careful, patient research. "I used to think healing meant the nightmares would stop completely," Sophia told him one evening, curled against his chest in the same window seat where she'd first told him she loved him. "My therapist says that's not really how it works. She says healing means the nightmares get smaller and you get bigger. You learn to hold them without letting them define everything else." "You've gotten so much bigger," Damien said, kissing the top of her head. "I don't know if you see that about yourself, but I see it every single day." Their relationship, too, had to navigate its own reckoning, the specific difficulty of building a life together in the shadow of a betrayal Damien's own family had committed against Sophia's, a wound that could not simply be closed by good intentions or genuine love. "I need you to understand something," Sophia said, one night nearly a year after the trial concluded, sitting across from Damien at the kitchen table in the mansion they'd chosen, together, to keep. "There are still moments when I look at your face and see your father's crimes reflected back at me. It's not fair to you. I know it's not fair, but it happens, and I don't think it's going to stop happening completely. Not ever." "I don't expect it to stop," Damien said. "I carry my father's sins too, Sophia, every day. I don't need you to pretend they don't exist for my comfort. I just need you to keep choosing, every day, whether you can build a life alongside that reality. And if the answer is ever no, if it ever becomes too much, I need you to tell me. I won't fight you on it. I promised you that a long time ago, and I meant it." Sophia reached across the table and took his hand. "I keep choosing you," she said. "Every single day since the trial ended, I've woken up and made the choice again, consciously, deliberately. Not because I've forgotten what your family did, because I've decided that you are not your father, and that the love you've shown me, the sacrifice, the honesty, the way you've rebuilt your entire life around protecting my future, matters more than the sins of a man who's dead and can never hurt me again. I choose you, Damien. I think I'll keep choosing you for the rest of my life." It was not, Damien understood, a resolution so much as an ongoing practice, a daily act of grace that Sophia extended to him, not because the past could ever be fully forgiven, but because the future they were building together was worth more than the weight of what had come before. Neither of them knew, sitting together at that kitchen table with the vineyard dark and quiet outside the window, that the final chapter of their story was still waiting to be written. A quiet Tuesday morning, 6 months later, that would bring the entire impossible journey full circle. 2 years after Damien Romano carried a nameless, terrified woman out of a warehouse on the Hudson, The vineyard on the hill bloomed under a June sky so blue it looked, Sophia often thought, like something painted rather than real. She stood at the edge of the same rose where she'd once hummed a half-remembered lullaby to a man she was only beginning to trust, watching him now from a distance as he walked toward her across the grass. No longer a mafia boss, no longer a man defined by fear and territory and the calculated distance he'd once believed necessary for survival, but simply Damien, in shirt sleeves, sunlight catching the grey that had begun in the last 2 years to thread through his dark hair. "You're staring," he said as he reached her. His smile, a real smile, unguarded, the kind he'd learned to give only in the years since she'd entered his life, settling something warm in her chest that had nothing to do with the summer heat. "I'm allowed to stare at my husband," Sophia said, holding up her left hand, the simple gold band catching the light. They had married quietly, 6 months after the trial's conclusion, in the exact spot where they now stood, with Elena crying through the entire ceremony, and a small handful of genuine friends, the ones who had proven their loyalty through the darkest months of the investigation, standing witness to a love neither of them had ever expected to survive, let alone flourish. "I'm allowed to stare at my wife," Damien said, pulling her close, one hand resting against the small, unmistakable curve of her stomach. "Both of you, actually." The pregnancy had been a surprise, not unwelcome, but unplanned, arriving in the midst of a life still finding its new equilibrium, still adjusting to Damien's work with the Catherine Foundation, where he now served as its full-time legal advocate, using the skills he'd once employed to build a criminal empire, to instead navigate the complex legal landscape of trafficking survivor advocacy and foster care reform. "Are you scared?" Sophia asked, as they walked together through the vineyard. The question one they'd circled many times in the months since discovering the pregnancy. "Terrified," Damien admitted honestly, because he had promised her all those months ago that he would try to always be honest, and it was a promise he had kept through every difficult, unguarded moment since. "I grew up watching my father run an empire built on violence. I don't have a single example in my own life of what a good father actually looks like. I'm scared I won't know how to give our child what she deserves." "She?" Sophia asked, smiling. "I have a feeling," Damien said, smiling back. "Call it instinct." "I think you already know exactly what a good father looks like," Sophia said, stopping to face him fully, her hand covering his where it rested against her stomach. "Because you've spent the last 2 years showing me every single day what real love actually looks like. Not the transactional, conditional love I always assumed was the only kind that existed, but something patient and honest, and willing to sacrifice everything rather than take the easy path. That's exactly the kind of father our daughter is going to have. I have no doubt about it at all." They had built, in the 2 years since the trial, something neither of them could have imagined in the depths of the conspiracy that had once threatened to destroy them both. A life defined not by power or fortune, but by the slow, patient work of healing, of building trust one careful day at a time, of choosing each other again and again in the face of a past that could never be entirely undone, but could, with enough love and enough honesty, be transformed into something worth building a future from. Marco had reached out once, nearly a year after his exile, a brief letter forwarded through Elena Marsh's office, thanking Damien for the surgery that had saved his daughter's life, and offering, without expectation of reply,
an apology that Damien had, after much thought, chosen to accept. Not with a restoration of their old friendship, which both men understood could never fully return, but with a quiet peace that allowed Damien to finally release the last piece of grief from that particular betrayal. The Reyes fortune, or what remained of it after the forfeiture proceedings, had been almost entirely redirected, some to the Catherine Foundation, some to a victims' compensation fund established for the various people harmed across 2 decades of fraud, and a small, symbolic portion set aside in trust for Sophia's future child. Not as an inheritance built on stolen blood, but as a fund earmarked specifically for the child's education, the only piece of the Reyes legacy Sophia had been willing to accept. "I used to think the greatest thing in the world would be finding out who I really was," Sophia said, as they reached the top of the hill overlooking the entire vineyard, the mansion, the life they'd built together stretching out below them in the golden June light. "I thought, if I could just get my name back, my history back, everything broken inside me would finally be fixed." "And now?" Damien asked. "Now I understand that the name never mattered," Sophia said. "Isabel Reyes was a stolen identity built on murder and fraud. Sophia, the name you gave me, the life we built together, that's who I actually am. Not because of blood or inheritance or anything written on a birth certificate, but because of every single choice we made together to build something real out of all that wreckage. That's the miracle, Damien, not finding a lost fortune. Finding someone who was willing to lose everything just to help me find my way back to myself." Damien pulled her close, resting his forehead against hers, feeling the small, persistent flutter of new life beneath his palm, and understood, with a certainty that had nothing to do with calculation or strategy or any of the cold instincts that had once defined his entire existence, that he had found, in the most unexpected place imaginable, everything a man could ever hope to want. Not an empire, not power, not even redemption exactly, though redemption had certainly been part of the journey. Just this. A woman who had survived the unsurvivable, a love built stone by careful stone out of trust that had once seemed impossible, and a future, finally, worth building. "I love you," Damien said, the words as true now as they had been the first time he'd said them, standing at a study window, watching snow bury a vineyard in white. "I will love you every single day for the rest of my life, and I will love our daughter with everything I have, and I will spend every day trying to be worthy of the family you've given me." "You already are," Sophia said, and kissed him, there on the hill, overlooking everything they'd built together, the sun warm on their skin, the past finally, truly, behind them. Below them, the vineyard stretched toward the horizon, rows of vines heavy with the promise of a harvest still to come, patient, ordinary, beautiful in its simplicity, exactly the kind of future neither of them had ever believed they were allowed to have. They had it now, together, and nothing, not empires, not fortunes, not the sins of fathers long dead, would ever take it from them again.